Good morning, all. I extend my heartiest welcome to distinguished speakers, policymakers, researchers, industry leaders, my NCR colleagues, and other participants. And I extend a special welcome to our distinguished inaugural speakers. We look forward to hearing from you. And it will be remiss on my part not to express my deepest appreciation to Professor Ravi Bapna for co-creating this flagship workshop and helping shape the foundational intellectual vision for this. And last but not the least, all the distinguished travelers from around the world, including from Bangalore, which is as far as traveling from Singapore, to be with us today. As we get all of you together on the new journey that NCR is embarking upon with regard to creating partnerships between academia, industry, policymakers, all under the auspices of this august organization. Since 1956, we have been at the vanguard of economic research, policy papers, inputs into the government budgets, economic surveys, analysis that has led meaningfully to the contributions to the public policy discourse in the country. Just sharing a bit about NCR with you, that we have had our contributions being acknowledged by the prime ministers, chief ministers, and our events have been attended by Nobel laureates, 200 economists from international universities and think tanks, and more than 250 from Indian universities and think tanks. So we are building this on the shoulders of the giants as we welcome all of you. Since establishment in 1956, our agenda has evolved as the country's priorities have changed. So when I took over this role in January, under the guidance of our chairman, Mr. Nandan Nilekani, vice chair Manish, and Ashish, who will be here probably later during the day, we decided to reposition NCER not just as an economic research powerhouse, but as an institution which operates at the intersection of economic research, policy, industry, while targeting the national emerging priorities over the next 2 to 3 decades. And our effort to get all of you together is to work on the theme or the intersection of DPI and AI, because we think that is going to play a hugely transformational role in the economic growth and the societal growth of this country. One of the philosophies that we believe in is that of non-linearity. If India has to adopt the growth path that it is aspiring for, then it has to adopt strategies that enable non-linear growth. And there cannot be a better example than adoption of digital public infrastructure and the impact that it has on India. I'm not even sure that we realize that it was just 15 years ago that DPI was launched, and was launched in September 2010. And you can visualize the incidents. It was in a village in rural Maharashtra, as giving out of the first digital identification to a tribal woman. It could have been just a photo op, like so many things happen. But it was not to be. That's the power of the idea. So I went further into this and I said, what was the discourse happening at that point in time? There were the photo ops, there were the politics, etc., etc. But what was the discourse happening at that point in time? What were the messages being put out into the media? What were they thinking? Because it will help us shape as we think about the AI and the intersection of DPI AI in the future. I'm paraphrasing a few messages that came through, primarily were put out by Nandan at that point in time. Number one, for millions of Indians, proving who they are is the first barrier to opportunity. Identity is a right, not a privilege. Aadhaar is a platform, not a card. Aadhaar is infrastructure. So even then, it was being thought through as an enabler, as an infrastructure. Aadhaar is a platform which will be used by the governments, banks, telecom companies, entrepreneurs, which then that philosophically evolved into what we call as the India stack. Scale changes everything, and it is an unprecedented exercise in nation building. Scale nation building. Aadhaar can lead to social inclusion through technology. Technology is normally, and you can associate it with today's AI, normally it is associated with the elite, with the urban India. But that time it was conceived to be adopted by the rural India, by the masses. And Aadhaar will be the foundation for better governance that will reduce leakages and improve service delivery, which later evolved into JAM, Jan Dhan, Aadhaar Mobile, and the DBT, which we are all aware of. As they say, history rhymes, if not repeats itself. As we stand today, we peep into the history because I think it establishes the basis for us to think about DPI and AI for the next 2 decades. And the workshop over the next 2 days would help us refine, analyze, discuss some of those ideas. Some of the questions that clearly evolve when Ravi and I and Manish were discussing as to what should be the agenda for NCAER to position itself in this is, how can AI built on DPI be the third revolution after Aadhaar and then DPI as an infrastructure project that it came through? Can DPI be the India's competitive advantage through AI? That is, AI makes DPI better, and can DPI make AI better, and how? So we have unique population scale digital rails in the form of Aadhaar, UPI, DigiLocker, ONDC, account aggregator frameworks, NPCI. How can AI sit on top of it or alongside it? How can India become the use case capital of AI? When the entire conversation is happening around frontier models, chips, agentic AI, etc., how can we use AI to solve real world problems at scale, i.e. in agriculture, health, education, skilling, finance, whatever? Here the goal is diffusion, not just innovation. How can AI solve India's language challenge? We are a country which is blessed with 22 national languages, 122 major languages, 1,500 distinct mother tongues and dialects. Yesterday, as Sonal and I were having, and we were debating this idea on how can AI be used to just capture this data so that we can reach out to the wider set of Indians in collecting what their requirements are, what their needs are, what they're thinking, which helps us to do better research. So multilingual AI could be critical for India's new wave of inclusion and growth. And lastly, how can AI be India's opportunity to public good at population scale? There is a lot to be discussed. These are some of the ideas. More ideas will evolve as we go through this 2 days of workshop. But for us, as I was sharing with some of you, this is not a standalone conference. We see this as a starting point for a multi-year institutional effort. We hope out of this, we will be able to set a medium-term national research agenda around AI and DPI at NCAER, through NCAER, working with our policymakers here, so that it could evolve into a dedicated center within NCAER, what we are hoping to call as Center for AI, DPI and Digital Futures. And that will be envisioned as a policy-oriented, interdisciplinary and globally networked institutional platform, serving as a permanent bridge for sustained collaboration between researchers, policymakers, regulators, infrastructure platforms, and industry practitioners. Thank you again for making time and effort to come over to be with us today. Thank you, sirs. Thank you, ma'am. And with that, I hand over to Manish to chair the session and take this forward. Thank you, Manish.
So, on behalf of the NCR board, I'd like to welcome all of you. Nandan is in the US, so you got a cheap substitute, but I'll try. And this should really have been his conference and is his conference, but unfortunately, he couldn't get out of what he was at. So, in my former job, we've hired somebody every 5 minutes for the last 25 years, but we've only hired 5% of the kids who came to us for a job. And so it becomes obvious to me at least, that there is no such thing as poor people. They are people in poor places, right? Which state you're born in, which city you're born in, which sector you work in, which firm you work in, and which skill you have, right? Karnataka and UP have the same GDP. I live in Bangalore. Karnataka does it with 1/5 the number of people of UP. So obviously the state really matters. With city matters. If everybody in India lived in Bangalore like me and Kamya, then India's GDP would be more than China. And so clearly the city is making a difference. But which sector you work in, we love IT, but IT only generates 0.8% of our, or only employs 0.8% of our labor force, but it generates 8% of GDP. While agriculture may be almost 42%, 4% of the labor force, but only generates 14% of GDP. Which firm you work in has a huge amount of difference. And I'm not just talking software versus other firms. In our largest and smallest manufacturing firms, we just finished some research, there's a 29 times difference in productivity. So if there's 29 times difference in productivity, you'll never pay the wage premium. But if you never pay the wage premium, you'll never be productive. So you get stuck in this low-level equilibrium of enterprise stack where 63 million enterprises in India, I mean, Saurabh is updating the number, it's probably more. 12 million don't have an office, 12 million work from home, only 12 million, 15 million register for GST. Only 1 million deduplicated pay social security, but there are only 30,000 companies in India with a paid up capital of more than $1 million. So the 6.3 crore enterprises translating only to 30,000 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores actually makes no sense. So firm really matters. And obviously with skill you have. We pay a 4 times difference in salary to usually a kid the same age with the same qualification on paper, but for feet on street sales, we might pay 12,000 to one kid and we might pay 45,000, 50,000 to the other kid. Now the difference will be body odor, it might be English, it might be same skills, but the way I think about inventory from a pure economist perspective, a BCom who is 22 years old should not have a 4 times difference in salary, but they do. So it's clear to me that the two most important decisions a child in India makes are to choose your parents wisely and your PIN code wisely. Is that a private sector problem? Is that a policy problem? Is that a historical problem? Do we have a choice here? And that's really where sort of the involvement of when we were lighting the lamp, I remember when Dr. Manmohan Singh, he used to be the chair of NCAER, but as Prime Minister, he laid the foundation stone for this. He had said that, NCR should not only be light bearing, it should also be fruit bearing. And that was really interesting way to think about the role of think tanks. Where think tanks are at their best when they narrow the gap between the worlds of practitioners, between regulators, policymakers, and academics. And you work on questions that matter to India. I know sometimes academia can be the pimple on the dimple on the left cheek of the ant, which is really interesting and really rigorous. But is it often as relevant as it should be? But we obviously need people to do that because obviously we come downstream and use your, work on that to work on policy to make it specific, finite, and actionable. But I think the gap between practitioners and academics has to be brought down, right? Thucydides, he was a Peloponnesian general. He used to say any army that has too much of a gap between its thinkers and doers will have its fighting done by fools and its thinking done by cowards. And I think that gap is I see it in our own company between our strategic thinkers and our sort of operational people. Thinkers like to look down on doers, saying you don't have the big picture. Doers look down on thinkers, saying that you don't do anything. And I think that's a silly and wasteful argument. And it's only in places like this where we can hopefully make them combine. But that question of why is the most important decision a child makes to choose your parents and PIN code wisely is a fascinating question, right? Why didn't India create mass prosperity to combine with our mass democracy? I mean, we have created the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of the world's most hierarchical society. But why didn't we create the world's largest economy? And I know that at least most of us know that the goofy economics after the 1955 Avadi resolution, really codified in the 1956 second five-year plan, were really damaging to entrepreneurship and mass prosperity. But it also now has been 35 years since 1991. And it really bothers me that India and China had the same per capita GDP in 1991, and now they are 5 times more than us. But what really other bothers me is in the last 25 years, China stock market has returned minus 13%. India's stock market has returned 1,300%. But China has moved 300 million people from farm to non-farm employment, while India still has 45% of our labor force in farm employment. Now, that would be counterintuitive if you told me that an autocracy or a dictatorship would deliver wage growth and the democracy would deliver stock market growth and not deliver wage growth, right? You would intuitively think that a democracy would care more about farm wage growth and moving people out of farms, but we didn't end up doing that. So what's the solution here? There are always three solutions to every problem, whether in policy, there's fiscal policy, there's monetary policy, and there's structural. I don't think there's anything else. You can gift wrap it the way you want. That's why Shinzo Abe's three arrows, 20 years ago are the same policy tools. I am quite disillusioned with fiscal and monetary policy. After a few years on the RBI board, I haven't decided whether monetary policy is a painkiller or a placebo or a steroid. It's definitely not a medicine. And on fiscal policy, government spending in India has gone up 108 times since 1990. Per capita GDP is up 8 times. The government used to spend about 85,000 crores in 1990. Today it spends almost 115 lakh crores. So clearly, if fiscal deficits could make countries rich, then why would country borders being poor? So I'm not clear that. So I think we've oversold fiscal and monetary policy. I think fiscal policy can prevent poverty. I'm not sure it can deliver mass prosperity, and monetary policy can deliver some macroeconomic stability. But finally, we need structural reform on the daily lives. We need to shift from the bird's eye view to the worm's eye view of the daily life of employers and the daily lives of citizens. That is really the question, because if you zoom out too much, you end up with fiscal and monetary policy. But if you start focusing on the daily lives of citizens and you focus on the daily lives of enterprises, you actually will think of 3 different or 4, 5 different kinds of reform. DPI is an innovation which straddles all three, right? It's of the kinds of interventions you can do. In government, there are 3 interventions: the flick of pen reforms, the institutional reforms, or the state capacity reforms. And I think DPI to me is interesting because it does a bit of all 3. You can do some stuff with flick of pen when you know who's asking for what. You can do some state capacity, and you can do a lot of institutional reform, especially in a year that has been tough for India. Right? Manufacturing feels much less labor intensive than it did. We asked the software industry why DeepSeek didn't come out of China. We asked the pharma industry how China became 1/3 of new drugs in the world from zero, from last year, from zero 20 years ago. Obviously, the energy crisis, currency pressure, and geopolitics have been periphery involved in the US trade negotiations, and it has been quite humiliating, right? Every time there's a new negotiator, anything you agree on, the ceiling becomes the floor. And they keep saying, we don't really, what does India have to offer us? We don't really need to do a deal here. And I guess the only lesson from this is you need to make yourself stronger. My favorite Hindi poet, Ramdhari Singh Dinkar, says, Shama Shobhati us bhujang ko jiske paas garal ho. Only snakes with venom can be kind, benevolent, and generous. Toothless, venomless snakes can't really. Only the strong can be kind, benevolent, and generous. And I think we have to, this gathering for me is an important part of making India stronger, right? For 3 reasons. Why is DPI important as a vector? For one, is obviously India is the world's largest natural data laboratory, right? We've gone from being data poor to data rich, the digital exhaust of 1.4 billion people, a national identity program, population scale payments, large welfare programs, rich administrative data sets, and significant regional diversity really gives us a chance to create a lot of evidence for digital inclusion, AI deployment, behavioral economics, platform economics, and digital governance over the next 10, 15 years as we start using this digital exhaust. I think DPI combining with AI could become the largest expansion of state capacity since 1991. So that's the second reason. I think historically we have in governments have increased state capacity through larger administrative structures, through more personnel, greater physical presence. But maybe we can combine DPI with AI to sort of deliver more services, monitor outcomes more effectively, detect fraud earlier, allocate resources better, and maybe respond more quickly without increasing the bureaucracy, right? In some sense, DPI is sort of AI. DPI without AI is sort of infrastructure. AI without DPI may just be intelligence. But AI plus DPI may become state capacity because you can suddenly extract patterns, predictions, and decision intelligence from them. So it's not more cooks in the kitchen, it's a different recipe, right? I have no problem with the state spending 115 lakh crores. But has this 108 times increase in government spending been accompanied by the tools, analysis, and foresight that AI could offer us, or in which we're just getting the money or spending the money for the people who need it rather than giving it to people who don't? The final one, why DPI conference is important, I think, is about it captures teamwork, right? One of the reasons India is poor is that we haven't had enough teamwork between the private sector, government, and nonprofits. And all three have a birth defects. The private sector has a trust deficit, the government has an execution deficit, and nonprofits have a scale deficit, right? And everybody looks down on everybody else. The private sector thinks everybody in the government is corrupt. The government thinks everybody in suits is profit seeking, money grubbing, and nonprofits look down on everybody, right? Because they're just so sanctimonious that they can't. The air must be rare on their high horse. But for too many years, and this lack of teamwork, because all three of us have different fitrats, as we say in Urdu, right? We have different natural instincts, and for even for people like me, reacting to the excesses of the license Raj, for years felt the best state was an invisible state. But obviously, if that was true, then Waziristan in Pakistan or Swat Valley in Afghanistan would be hotbeds of venture capital, right? That's not how the world works. And actually, you just need the three people to work together. And obviously, I was punished for that ignorant ideology that a good state is an invisible state in a recent book I wrote about Indian pharma, where it's clear to me that Indian pharma, which now, Americans ate 400 billion pills last year, 200 billion of them were made in India, that industry would not exist without government policy, the 1970 Patents Act and the 1984 Hatch-Waxman Act. So it's clear that enlightened policy really matters. The UPI layer would not exist because if it were left to banks, and banks really opposed UPI. There must be some bankers here, I hope they'll be honest enough to agree that they really believed that UPI was a bad idea. They fought UPI, they tried to sabotage UPI, and UPI would not exist if we didn't have enlightened policymakers who didn't listen to the incumbents and sort of said, no, we will open it up. So the magic lies in sort of when policy partners with smart entrepreneurs, right? It's not only policy. It's that tug of war metaphor needs to be replaced by a dance metaphor in my mind. It's not one or the other. And DPI sort of does all three things. So it's an important data laboratory. We combine with AI and we mandate teamwork. So in closing, before we jump into the panel, because you already, to my mind, DPI could really enhance state capacity. It could improve access and equity. It could do three things. It could raise our growth and productivity, which is one bucket. It could improve access and equity, which is the other bucket. And the third bucket is state capacity. So far, I think it's done a bit of the first two. It's improved access and state capacity, but it really hasn't yet contributed to growth and productivity. We don't have enterprise DPI, for example. I think the 67,000 compliant, the regulatory cholesterol for employers you obviously need to do deregulation to go at the source, but you could also digitize and create DPI, which would make some of that also much easier. So it's wonderful to be here. I think, when I landed in the US in August 1994 for my MBA, there was a front page article on the Wall Street Journal which said that India is more interesting than important. I hope that journalist is eating the newspaper on which she wrote that, because what's happening in India is not once in a decade or once in a millennium. It's really once in the lifetime of a country. But we do need to remind ourselves that we missed our tryst with destiny, right? There are 200 million people in India who will never read the newspaper that they deliver, or sit in the car that they clean, or send their kids to the school that they help build. But this isn't a problem like cancer or climate change. This is a plumbing problem. It's clearly a problem that we can solve, and DPI is an important part of that solution. So thank you, and look forward to the panel, and we'll take questions at the end of it. So would you like to speak from here, ma'am, or would you from there? Whatever you'd like. There?
Distinguished guests, panelists, uh, members from the academia, from various institutions, from media, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege for me to be here today and to talk on the subject of economics of the AI and DPI. We, as a country, have been recognized worldwide as the people who brought DPI. That's not something which has been there in other countries, and that's what makes it very unique for us. So, the digital public infrastructure is a set of interoperable platforms which are providing various kinds of services. So, what's happening on the AI front is that we are seeing growth at a very rapid pace. Unprecedented levels of growth is happening. AI is changing the way the entire ecosystem works. So, we have the way businesses will compete with each other, the way consumers will make choices, and the way governments will function, and the way markets will operate. So, everything is going through change. And in that scenario, the digital public infrastructure is providing a base. It is providing a system where people can have access. That is the very important thing about DPI, that it has increased access to the internet, to the digital services. However, when we look at AI, we are finding that AI is having numerous benefits. So there are a lot of benefits which are coming from AI. I would like to, in fact, go back to a study that we had done on AI and competition, where we looked at what is happening in India, and it was completely focused on the country. And we came up with the conclusion that AI is having numerous benefits. So it is leading to innovation, it is improving access, it is leading to a lot of efficiencies. But then the way it is being adopted, there are going to be what we have seen in digital markets is getting exaggerated even more. So we are seeing more network effects, we are seeing more economies of scale, we are seeing more opaqueness now coming in through the AI systems. That is where the issues are coming up. And when we look at the adoption of AI and the implication it can have for competition, that's when we start thinking of what could be the potential concerns which are coming from AI. From the competition perspective, the concerns are basically linked to self preferencing. They are linked to the use of leveraging of your own position to increase your market dominance, to increase concentration levels. And this could also be leading to concentration in various levels of the AI value chain. So, those are the kind of concerns that we are looking at. And bringing in economics into all this, I think we need to understand as a competition regulator, we are administering an act which is not only a legislative piece, it is also having a very strong focus on economics. So, whatever work we do, we have to look at what is the implication particular conduct is having on the market. And that's where Data analytics comes into in a big way. We look at what is happening in terms of the market parameters, how they are changing. So economics is coming in very strongly into our work when we look at the competition effects. But when we look at AI now, when we are administering our act, because AI is now gradually moving towards agentic AI. So, how does one look at liability? Who are the people who are going to be liable for those outcomes which are happening in the market? That's one of the very important aspects we tried to address in our study. When we did our market study last year, which is available on our website, we said, how do we look at this aspect? That how do we look at promoting competition in a scenario where AI tools and applications are being adopted very rapidly? So, some of the suggestions that we came up with, one of the key ones was that let us look at self audit. Let the people who are going to deploy those AI systems be the ones who will be responsible, whether it is looking at the development of AI, whether it is the uh, launching of those AI tools, and then subsequently monitoring them. So it is the people who are at the helm of affairs. So we've identified with various actions which can be taken by the boards, the managements of these enterprises to ensure that the outcomes which are coming at the end of it, somebody is looking at it at all the various stages of development and deployment. It is not as though something happens suddenly and nobody is aware of it. The second thing which we as a regulator recommended was that there should be greater transparency. So the people who are deploying those AI systems, they should go out and spread more awareness. The information asymmetry which is happening because of these opaque AI systems, that is the way we can address it through greater disclosures. A very important aspect of DPI now, when we look at DPI, in the case of DPI, we are getting the benefits of innovation, we are getting the benefits of access, but there's one very big additional benefit which is coming, that is the trust and credibility of the system. That is something on which people can rely upon. And similarly, whenever the enterprises, whenever the business entities are going to adopt AI tools, we're looking at them coming up with a system which is more transparent, which discloses everything, and which is more accountable. So, those are the very important starting points where we are examining how AI can have an impact on competition, because that is a main concern. As a competition regulator, it is our job to see that we promote competition. So we have to ensure that the competitive opportunities are enhanced, but in a manner where the systems do not move towards anti competitive conduct, which is in terms of dominance, which is in terms of anti competitive agreements happening among various entities, whether they are at the same level of the value chain or they are vertically integrated. So, that is the concern that we would like to address and look at it from our standpoint. Another very big benefit which has come from the adoption of AI, whether when it comes to governance, is that the systems can now quickly detect frauds. The level of economic intelligence has gone up. And similarly, when we look at the level of accuracy in policy making, that has also gone up in terms of being able to understand what is going to be the impact of those policies and how one can do better targeting of the services. So, the government service delivery can be improved through AI. We can have better targeted policy making, policy outcomes can be ensured, and we can move towards a scenario where things are moving in a more predictable fashion. The issue is only with regard to, as a competition regulator, for us to ensure that we have innovation coupled with accountability, with transparency. It is not that the agencies are undertaking innovation, but here nobody is able to detect what is happening. Similarly, the data, how the data is being used, that is a very important aspect for us. Because as we have looked at digital markets for a very long time, a very important aspect of that is that you are getting free services, but what is being actually traded is data. It is the data which is being used, it is being processed, and it is being put to use, or it is being sold to third parties where the concerns are coming in. And the similar thing is also possible in case of AI. So these are the issues that we look at. And in our recent changes, we've also understood now as a regulator that things move at a very fast pace. Markets can tip very quickly, and that is in fact enhanced multiple times with the adoption of AI. So therefore we have brought in some new changes. One, of course, is a very important thing, is that we've come up with a settlement and commitment framework, that we say that big tech companies, if they are found to be indulging in, or there are allegations of anti-competitive conduct, then we are providing a window where they can come and make commitments, take actions which remedy and address those market concerns, so that we are able to have quick market correction and we are able to protect the MSMEs and the startups, because that is a very critical aspect for us, that looking at growth, we have to keep encouraging innovation through these startups, through these new entities which are coming up, and even these small micro enterprises. So that is one of the major reform which we have done recently. The other thing where the Competition Commission has addressed the issue of possible anti-competitive practices is through prescribing a deal value threshold. So we have now, in our merger regime, we say that we are not only looking at entities which are meeting certain asset, certain turnover thresholds, we are also going to look at killer acquisitions. So acquisitions which have a deal value of rupees 2,000 crores and which are being undertaken, potentially could be undertaken with the intention of eliminating competition. So that is where we would like to come in and play a role, and that has already been notified. So now all transactions in September 2024 will have to come before the Commission for mandatory approval in case they are meeting this deal value threshold. So as a regulator, we are trying to be very agile. We are keeping up with the times. We are also carefully watching the markets, giving guidance to people. And in terms of our own internal capacity, also we have done a lot of work on that front. We are building up capacity, both also engaging people from different streams when it comes to having people from data science. That is the new thing we have added to our enforcement toolkit, so to say. So as a regulator, we keep on expanding our enforcement toolkit. And at the heart of all this is that what does the economic analysis show, that how AI is progressing, what is happening with the DPI, and with a view to be able to fully get the benefit of these new changes which are happening, however, keeping a watchful eye on how things are panning out. A very important aspect of AI, when we look at it from the competition standpoint, is also this thing of machine learning, generative AI, and how it can be used even without any human intervention. So, that is something which we are also looking at as to how the competition regulator will address that aspect tomorrow in case it emerges for us. So, as a regulator, we are trying to keep pace. We are trying to get our enforcement toolkit also updated regularly, and we are bringing in these new changes. The intention is that as a country, we need to go forward and fully use these benefits which can come from both AI and DPI. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, Suresh, and Manish for putting together this fabulous event. I'm really excited to share some of the insights that I've gathered over the last few years working on issues relevant to this event. What I thought I'll do today is share with you what I've been doing for the last, I'd say, precisely 5 years.
I know some of you, I see a lot of familiar faces. Some of you know what I've been doing. For the rest of the room, I am a professor at NYU, but between 2020 and 2025, for about 5 years, I took a complete break from academia and joined Compass Lexicon. Compass Lexicon is part of FTI, and we are the largest litigation support firm in the US. And the reason I joined them is because I was retained by Meta, which is Facebook, Google, and a few other companies like Apple and OpenAI to work on their antitrust cases. And so Manish said we should talk about in the rules of three. So I have three things to talk about today. The first case study I'll talk about is the work that went behind the Meta antitrust case. And I'll talk about the insights there. The second is about what happened in the Google antitrust cases. And the last thing I'll talk about is what I expect potential regulatory concerns in the context of AI. So, in fact, what Ms. Kaur talked about resonated with me very much because we are already seeing a lot of that happen in the US and in Europe. So that's the agenda. So, for some of us who are not from the US, just to give some context, these were the two largest antitrust cases brought by the US regulators. So, in the US, just like in India, we have CCI. In the US, we have the DOJ, the Justice Department, and then we have the Federal Trade Commission. And each of them independently took on some of these large tech companies with the objective of trying to break them apart, right? So the FTC went after Meta, erstwhile known as Facebook, with the goal of saying, look, you acquired Instagram and WhatsApp, and yes, we approved those mergers many years back, but oops, we made a mistake. So now we're going to have to dismantle that. And the Justice Department went after Google in two different cases, the search antitrust case and the ad tech antitrust case, saying that you have a monopoly or you're a monopoly-like player in that space, right? So these are some of the headlines that many of you probably saw at least in the Western media and in the European media, that the FTC went after Facebook saying we have to break you guys apart because you are a monopoly. And same like I mentioned with the US in the Justice Department, they accuse Google of being a monopoly-like player in search and advertising. And so I think with that context being given, I'll just very quickly give you the outcome because that's the good news. Right. So I was the testifying expert on the Meta case, one of the experts, and we won the case hands down. So the judge, when they made their ruling, had they used very, very complimentary words in terms of this being one of the cleanest antitrust wins in the history of the US. So I'll walk you through, what are some of the strategies more that we actually deployed in that case. In the Google case, it was a half win, half loss. We won the advertiser side of the cases, so I was the advertiser expert. So I'll tell you all the good news of what we did on the advertiser side. The context here that is sort of relevant is up until these matters, I was told we had never before seen the extensive use of heavy econometrics and machine learning and experiments in these matters, right? So a lot of the prior cases, and including the ones that I'd worked on, we did use some data, but nothing of the extent that we've used in these cases. And we had to go well beyond the standard, statistical regression methodologies and deploy far more advanced techniques in these cases. And in the initial years, I was a bit skeptical about, would this be appreciated by the politicians and the judges and the lawyers? And it turns out actually pleasantly surprised to see how receptive they were. And not only that, they were on top of this stuff. So you have to be on your toes all the time. So how does an antitrust case work? It's really simple in a sense that it all starts with the definition of what is a market, right? So anytime, let's say a government goes after a large company saying that you violated antitrust laws, they first have to start by defining what is the market in which this violation has happened. So in our case, I had to testify across in front of like three sets of audiences. So we had, regulators like the Justice Department and FTC. The FTC at that time was headed by Lena Khan, and DOJ was headed by Jonathan Cantor. I also had to get in front of many of the attorney generals of certain states. So the most active attorney generals were from Texas, California, Arizona, New York, and New Mexico. And then with senators, they didn't necessarily have a crusade. It was more like they really wanted to like bring experts from both sides to get a sense for what we really thought about it. Um, the expert work that went inside my report was in front of regulators and the attorney generals. With senator is more of a hearing. Okay, so very simple formula. How do you define a market? It's a really simple mathematical fraction that the market share of a company, any company, is essentially a ratio of its own market share versus the share of multiple other competitors, right? So, if you look at it from the antitrust perspective, on the defense side, right, on the side of Meta or Google or Apple, they have to prove that their market share is low, and the only way to prove that is to essentially expand the number of firms in the denominator. The more firms you can convincingly argue in the denominator, the smaller your market share. The government, the FTC, the DOJ, the European Commission, their goal is to shrink the market in the denominator so that the numerator becomes large enough. And at least in the US, there's an act called the Sherman Act. And typically in the Sherman Act, they look for 70% or more of market share as a potential monopoly-like behavior. Okay, so although it's not necessarily written in law, but that's the benchmark that we often use. So what I'll do is over the next few minutes, I'll walk you through how we systematically decimated the government arguments with respect to market share, and you will see that eventually we were able to prove that the market share is nowhere close to 70. In the case of Meta, it was about 20%. In the case of Google, it was at most 28%. Okay, so the devil's always in the details. So just bear with me as I walk you through this. Okay, so as I briefly mentioned this, the history is so far. If you are on WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, just a show of hands, how many of you are on all three? Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. Okay, how many of you are on two of these? Okay, and anyone? Okay, I think the entire room is covered, right? So if you use any one of these three products, you probably know a little bit of the history that originally these were independent startups, but in 2012 and 2014, Facebook acquired Instagram and WhatsApp, right? These deals were approved by the FTC after systematic due diligence. However, about 8 years later, they came back and said, like I mentioned, we didn't really see the light at the end of the tunnel, and Facebook, you were bad because you essentially acquired monopoly power. So the government's definition, and this is where things get interesting, their definition of the market is Facebook was alleged to be a monopoly in something called personal social networking. Okay, that's how they define the market. So just pay attention to these three words, personal social networking, because the moment you add the word personal in front of social networking, there's a very clear objective to that. When you say social networking, you can make the argument that a number of different companies exist in the space, such as Twitter and TikTok and LinkedIn and Pinterest, etc. But when you add the word personal, the FTC's claim was by adding the word personal, we are positioning Meta as a company that only allows friends and family sharing. So in other words, the reason I asked you if you're on any one of these three products is if I were to say that when you go to Facebook, okay, the only thing you do is connect with your friends and family, I wonder, how many of you would agree with that? But that was the FTC's argument. So my job was to essentially look at the data and essentially chip at that argument and say, look, I don't think that's actually true, right? So the first thing we did is we looked at how much time people actually spend on the Facebook newsfeed on content from friends and family. So we looked at 5 years of data over millions of Meta users, not just in the US, but across the world, including India. And it turns out only about 38% of the time is spent by people connecting with friends and family. That's meaningful, but it's nowhere close to that 70% magical number. On Instagram, that number is even smaller. On Facebook, the overall time is 22%, but on Instagram, that's 11%. So in other words, for 80 to 90% of the rest of the time, what are we doing? Well, we are reading news articles, we are watching reels by unconnected influencers, we are watching videos, we are transacting the marketplace, we're doing a bunch of things that goes well beyond friends and family. So this was the first thing that we showed. The second thing is we said, look, let's go back to the last 20 years. And when the government says that none of these other networking companies actually compete with Facebook, well, let's take a look at the evolution of these companies, their products, and their features. Now, if you see this chart, you will see that over the last 20 years, a number of different companies have essentially copied or been inspired by Facebook and have essentially adopted the same or very similar features. And there must be a reason why they're adopting these features. If they're adopting these features, they're smart people running these companies, it must be the case that they think of themselves at least as partial substitutes. Okay. So I'm not going to show you all the detail, but we had access to data from all these other companies, because in the US, if you're part of a litigation, you can subpoena the other rivals as well. And we had individual consumer level data. So if you are using any of the other products like TikTok or Snapchat or YouTube, all of that data is available to us as an expert, right? So we looked at that and we saw significant levels of multi-homing. So what this chart shows you is the fraction of people who are there on Facebook who also are there on any of these potential competitors, right? So like if you look at the very first cell over here, this one, 44% of people on Facebook are also on TikTok. Okay. And so you can essentially go down this, the columns and the rows and figure out that if the same person, the same John Doe and the same Jane Doe are there on multiple apps, there must be some element where they get similar or the same value from using the other app. Okay? So anyway, it's like the point is, we systematically went down this path. Then we looked at those of the academics in the room, you're aware of, differences in natural experiments. So in 2021, there was a major outage on Meta. And for several days, in fact, you couldn't use any of these apps. So we looked at where did people go when Facebook was not available, when Instagram was not available. Where did people go? Well, it turns out they went to TikTok and YouTube and all of that. Similarly, when TikTok was banned for a few days, when President Trump first came into power, a year and a half ago, he said, yes, I'm going to just, ban TikTok. And, eventually they took the ban off. When TikTok was banned, people started going to Facebook and Instagram. So, essentially the point being that you could see from the data that it's really hard for the FTC's experts to make the argument that these are not competitors. Okay. The final nail in the coffin was actually we leveraged what happened in India, right? So this was very powerful, at least for the judges in this court. As you know, in India, in June of 2020, right, the government banned TikTok, right? At the time, all the Chinese apps were banned. So if you look at the chart over here, the blue curve and the red curve, right, these two curves, this is the time between 2019 and 2020. You show that the trajectory of India and the rest of the world is very similar, right? The usage of, Facebook on these platforms are very similar. But the moment the ban was enacted in June of 2020, what you see is that the red curve, which is the rest of the world, that remained the same. But the blue curve took off because TikTok was no longer available to people in India. So what did we do? Well, we substituted from TikTok to Facebook. Okay. So this is what we call an exogenous shock that hits the system that lets you evaluate causally, what are the outcomes that happen. And the same story happened with Instagram, very similar trajectory. Until June of 2020, the world and India's trajectory was very similar. When TikTok was banned, Instagram usage in India really spiked up because we had no other choices. So the last thing I'll say is the final outcome that decided the case in Facebook's favor is the eventual market share that we proved through systematic analysis of data was less than 20%. In other words, the time spent by people across these platforms on Meta's properties was less than 20%. So there were other things that I don't have time to talk about. There's another expert, John Liss, who did a very, very interesting field experiment too. So over time, multiple analysis converge to the same data point. Okay, so I'll move on to the Google case. The Google case was similar and yet different. Again, notice the definition of the market. The DOJ, this is not the FTC now, this is Jonathan Cantor and his team in DOJ. They said Google is a monopoly in open web display. not in display advertising, but in open web display. So again, pay attention. By adding the words open web in front of display, the DOJ's goal was to narrow down the market significantly so they could argue, oh, it's only Google in the market, there's nobody else. Okay. So their goal is to show that the market share is 70% or above. My goal was to decimate or weaken their argument. So this is the context. This is an advertising case and not a social networking case. So typically, if you see in marketing, in marketing literature, we look at something called the purchase funnel, the consumer path to purchase. And it turns out it's usually in the form of this inverted triangle because, a lot of people become aware of products. Some people might be interested in them, but very few people actually buy those products. So when you look at the funnel journey from awareness to interest to desire to final action, it's an inverted triangle because there's attrition at each stage. Now, what the government said is, each of these different advertising formats and platforms are relevant to uniquely relevant to each stage. Okay, so what does this mean? They said, look, you have banner ads, you have mobile ads, you have native ads and video ads and social and retail ads. Well, these are all different markets, right? So their argument is each of these ads are different markets because they have different objectives or they have different outcomes. Okay. So once again, the onus was on me and my team to disprove this using data and using the kind of methods we use, in scientific research. So the first, goal over here is how does one go about disproving this scientifically, right? Not verbally or qualitatively, but scientifically. Just to show you how, ridiculous the argument was. Here's some examples. So on the left, you see an ad from some wealth management firm called Fisher Investments. This is an ad of Fisher Investments in the New York Times website for a given article. This is the exact same ad for the exact same company and same creative on the exact same article on the New York Times app. Okay, nothing changes. However, the DOJ said, well, this ad is in the competitive market, but this ad is not in the market. Okay. So that's, in a way, that's really bizarre, right? But again, you can't just go on in front of the judge and say it's bizarre. It's not going to work, right? So you actually have to show the evidence. A few other examples. You see on the left is an ad from high-speed internet on a newspaper website called the Daily Mail. On the right is the exact same ad. Okay. Nothing changes except it's on Instagram. So again, the government says the ad on the left is in the competitive market, but the ad on the right is not. So the point is, these are all pretty ridiculous arguments, but how do you prove this empirically, right? And so what we started looking for was we started looking at actual street evidence in the industry. What are companies doing, right? So Manish talked about the importance of academia and industry bridging the gap. And one of the things we did is we said, look, obviously we can look at what the literature says, but I was very much interested in looking at what actual practitioners were doing, right? If we could find evidence that real world companies are actually, in fact, substituting between these ad formats, well, that will go a long way, right? Well beyond a single paper. That being said, and many years ago, one of my ex-PhD students, now she's a star professor, her name's Vilma Todri at Emory. Her dissertation defense, coincidentally, was exactly this issue. In her first paper, she had showed that different types of display ad formats are, in fact, substitutes, right? And we published this in one of the top information system journals. Her second paper showed something very relevant to this case, that that funnel that I talked about is not a static one-way funnel. Is very iterative, is very dynamic. So when you get in front of politicians or judges or attorney generals and you start testifying with your own work, it adds a lot of street cred. So we were fortunate that this paper is already published. But then we said, let's go to the practitioner and see what they are doing. And what we ended up doing over the next 5 years is we gathered data from 25 different organizations over 10 years. And I know this is not necessarily my class, but I wanted to show you a sense for. I only have 5 minutes, right? So I'm not going to interpret all of the models. But here's what we looked at. We looked at different kind of models that showed that advertisers and agencies were actually swapping between different ad formats. Okay. And we did that systematically for multiple government, federal advertisers. We did that for multiple, private companies, all of this. So here's the final slide. What is the actual market share of Google that we could prove? The maximum market share of Google in the display ad market was 28% or less. Okay, the rest of the market is in fact captured by other companies that the DOJ claim are not in the competitive set. So remember, I was saying the DOJ said that, hey, retail ads and social ads and other ads are not in the market. Well, they are in the market. We proved that. And once you include them in the market share for Google was actually 28%. Okay. So again, the expectation is 70% or above. The reality is less than 28%. So again, this was on the advertiser side. This was a very clean win that Judge Brinkema, she's actually 82 years old, but sharp as a knife. Like she really kept us on our toes. But this is a slide that I was told later convinced her that this is the thing for Google. Okay. All right. So the last thing I'll talk about is what did I learn from these two cases that I expect will pan out in the AI world as well, right? In the AI space. So I mentioned Ms. Scott talked about a few things, but I'll sort of start with maybe just keep it to the AI value chain. And in full disclosure, I'm doing some work for OpenAI and Apple that is relevant to this. But here's what the high level AI tech stack looks like, right? So if you're familiar with the value chain, then you've probably seen something of this sort. But essentially, what does the AI economy looks like? It looks like the following. At the very bottom, you have the energy infrastructure. Then you have semiconductor chips. Then you have data centers. Then you have the foundation model companies. You have software companies and the AI application, right? This is what Jensen Huang called the 5-layer or the 6-layer cake, right? In the Davos speech. Now, if I simplify this a little tad bit and say, look, okay, here's what it looks like: AI applications, AI models, cloud computing, and semiconductor chips. This is what this framework looks like. Where do consumers actually play a role? Well, we typically essentially interact with the first two layers, right? Either you are on the AI application layer or the AI model layer. So how many of you have an LLM app on your phone, like a ChatGPT or Grok, Lottie? So a lot of you, right? So that way you're interacting with the first two layers. But if you're an enterprise, you have to pay attention to everything that's going on beyond that too. Okay. If I show you some of the key players in the space, starting from the bottom, although many of us have heard of NVIDIA and AMD, probably some of us may not know that Amazon produces its own chips. Okay, Microsoft also produces its own chips. Okay, and these are and benchmark analysis are very, very competitive in terms of what they're able to deliver. So I would say that the same names you can see start appearing in each layer. So this is where things start getting really interesting, right? So you have to have vertical integration, and there's one particular company I'll mention. I'll give an example. A well-known bank, a global bank, goes to Microsoft, and not a single Microsoft, they're a great company, but they go to Microsoft and say, "Hey, can you guys help us build an AI application?" And Microsoft's team says, "Sure, we can do that, right? But you will have to use our LLM models, you have to use our chips, and you have to use our cloud computing data centers." So that's the deal, right? You can get what you need, but everything has to be single stop shop, belong to us. And so in sort of regulatory world, we call this bundling, tying. And so the question that I'm posing is, I see where the winds are blowing. The next generation of antitrust cases in the AI space are likely to originate from this value chain, because if that practice starts spreading, when a handful of 4 or 5 companies in the guise of vertical integration enforce foreclosure and prevent, let's say, end consumers from having choices, there potentially is a case to be made that this is not consumer friendly. This is potentially anti-competitive. Okay? And the second issue where I see is, you talked about data as a important asset, super important in this case. Here's why. So there are 2 layers in this cake where data is an important asset in the AI application layer, right, and in the AI model layer. Why has data been such an important asset? Because typically we have been told that data is a entry barrier. The more data you feed an AI algorithm, right, the better outcomes you get. Now, for those of us with some experience in machine learning, you know that that's not necessarily true. At some point, it sort of starts to flatten out. That's an inverted U at some point, but it starts to flatten out. But what's really interesting in the AI world is we are already seeing evidence that these pre-trained Gen AI models, like the large language models, they're actually reducing barriers to entry. Okay. Um, the efficiency that we are now seeing companies get from smaller data sets is actually often matching what they would have gotten from the typical large companies. And there's a lot of like advanced AI methodologies that explain this. Many of you are familiar with transfer learning, reinforcement learning, RAG models. It's those techniques that are showing that you don't need the amount of data that you thought you needed. And so in a way, in a sense, the smaller players can actually now enter this ecosystem, reducing the barriers to entry and potentially increasing competition. Okay. And there is some evidence. So there was a study out of UNC that showed that there was a 7% increase in entry because of smaller firms being able to enter this space a lot more. So anyway, I thought I'll just share these tidbits with you because I think there's a lot more to come, but I'll leave it at this point and happy to take questions later on in the panel. Yeah.
Good morning and pleasure to be here. And I must say that extremely interesting presentations by all the panelists. Okay. So I'll be talking of data, which is where I think Anindya left off on data and what we are doing in data to harness AI more effectively as we move ahead. In the in India Stack 1.0, I think we've spoken about the identity layer, about the population scale authentication that's possible now. We spoke about UPI, which ensures transactions to happen and the kind of scale that has been reached in that. We spoke about moving or ensuring the consent architecture is there, whether it's DigiLocker or account aggregator, etc., so that the payments and identity, you can prove who you are effectively across on the internet without being physically present. And of course, all this has led to delivery of services, which has been so much more effective. You heard of DigiLocker, DigiYatra, I'm sure many of you might have used it. And all these are obviously based on a consent-based data access, which is possible. Going forward, where perhaps we need to, and I think that was alluded to in the earlier talks about moving to an intelligence infrastructure, we have the DPI in place, and I'm sure they are continually evolving and new DPI are coming forward. But I think it's the second pillar that we are talking of, and I'll be talking about, is on the data pipeline, which in a way is the foundation for AI. The raw material of AI is data. You have energy, you have chips, you have models, but without data, AI is really not there. And what is needed to ensure that data is interoperable, harmonized, and machine readable is something which we are still grappling with, at least in India and many other countries too. And of course, phase 3 is where we hope all this will be much more used for a public benefit, and where we will go on that. So I'm not really going to talk over the third phase. I'll focus on the second one. Where we are as of now is that systems are able to exchange data. The file transfers are happening. APIs are common. And what I would term it as, we are at the stage of structural interoperability. We've solved that issue. But I think where we need to work more is on the semantic interoperability, that AI systems or artificial intelligence can understand the context of that, the definitions and the classifications. And this is extremely important because if uh, uh, if a definition of maybe any concept by in two systems is different, then those two systems can't talk to each other. And in fact, it's an example that we just looked at in terms of housing in India. We have 5 different ministries with 5 different definitions of what is a pakka house. We have some looking at the wall, and it needs to be there. If we talk to disaster management, they also want to look at the roof. If you talk to the health department, they want to look at the flow, because that's where a number of diseases come in, and that leads to issues when there's a government intervention program which is basically for housing to assist people who don't have a pakka house. So what is a pakka house? So I think this definitional issue is not trivial. It's extremely important, and in artificial intelligence, it becomes all the more, because the level of agentic AI that we have reached at level, I think they can't go to that level and try and understand the differences. Maybe in future we would be able to, but semantics is extremely important, and I think that is one area that we are working on. And that's why AI requires that the data is trustworthy. And what do we mean by trustworthy? It needs to be structured in terms of AI can read PDFs, can read images, but there's always some error in that. So it needs to have a format which is machine readable. It makes things so much more easier, and the errors would reduce. AI model, typically when it looks at a data, it looks at its metadata, what is it in that data, and then decides whether it needs to go into it in detail or move on to the next one. And therefore, the metadata is extremely important. Interoperable in terms of having common geographies. When we talk of a city, are we talking about the municipal boundary? Are we talking about like in Delhi, whether you're talking about Delhi state, you're talking about NCR, you're talking of New Delhi, what is it that you're talking of? And obviously it has to have a basic quality assessment. It needs to of a basic quality, otherwise the credibility of data is suspect. And it is this data harmonization is something that within the government is extremely high priority for us. So just to give what is the data ecosystem and why it's so difficult to do it immediately. Just giving 5 sets of data, and this I'm only talking in terms of the government aspects, and why also of the government, because government probably has the largest amount of data, which is also possibly can be put in the public domain, because private sector data would always there would be competitive issues, they may not be willing, and the data of the government can very easily be leveraged much more to generate economic value for people. And that's why it's very important that this data has a certain level of harmonization where other aspects can be developed. I think a number of people have talked of data as the 5th factor of production after land, labor, capital, and knowledge and technology. And it's very right that we can, and AI models are showing how we can generate economic value out of data alone. So you have these 5 sets of data: administrative data, which is generated across systems, ministries, etc., census and surveys, which has been the traditional way of generating data; geospatial, which is more recent; and of course alternate data, which is more technology based, that you have these large volumes of data and how can you utilize it. And the biggest problem is how will these 5 sets of data talk to each other to make sense. And but when we are talking of integrated intelligence at scale, it would be expected that all of this data should be used to ensure that the impact and the economic value that we generate is so much more. The challenges in this, the data is siloed. It's in different systems, different formats, different walls behind which it is there. Interoperability and issues I already mentioned. It's not only the way it is stored, but it cannot be compared. The standards and classifications I mentioned, they vary across, and obviously the quality varies, and which then all of this combined leads to issues of data credibility, and whatever decisions that one wants to make, they will always remain suspect. And therefore, there is this international uh, word that is fair, that data should be fair. It should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I think this, in a way, captures what we want to do with data as we go ahead. And I think each of these terms are self-explanatory. I don't need to really talk of what we mean by findable, interoperable, reusable, and accessible. And FAIR is just a data management policy. It's not a IT platform, but more of a data management policy to get there. Apart from data at a broad level, on, as I mentioned, the data needs to be fair. But one level below, if we look at it, data has to be current. I mean, it might be findable, it might be accessible, but data, if it is a 50-year-old data, the value of that is so much less. So we need to ensure that data remains current, that it's available at dynamically updated at regular intervals. A one-time updation is a limited aspect. It needs to be comprehensive in the context of India. If we have data of 10 states and we don't have it for another 15, the value of that data is so much less, and therefore it needs to be comprehensive. And the granularity at which, is it required at the national level, state level, district level, panchayat level? Obviously, the value of that data keeps increasing as the granularity keeps increasing. So these are inherent within the data itself. I'm not getting into these issues, but obviously these would the different data sets, the value of different data sets would vary depending on how they are on any one of these attributes. So what is the data governance architecture that we are talking about? Is obviously first that it has to be discoverable. We need catalogs, we need different data layers. In fact, we've done the first step of identifying within the government system a set of 288 data sets which we think are important from economic point of view, social point of view. It's there on our website. We've listed them off across the ministries. And we've also listed a metadata structure that they need to follow, so that that's the first step that that the data achieves. The second is in terms of interoperability. Of number one, we need to define the identifiers, because if you want two sets of data to talk to each other, whether person X is there in two data sets, we need to have some identifier, and we've identified 38 different types of identifiers that can be used. There could be individual attributes, there could be enterprise attributes, there could be geographical attributes. And the second set is the classifications, the definition. I just gave one example. There are 88 different international classifications. A tourism data set has a different data classification, a telecom data set has, but there is an international classification, so that as long as it's that sectoral, you can there's a basis for looking at of being interoperable across countries. And then, of course, there has to be a data sharing framework or protocol. We have some in place, but others we would need to develop. And this is probably the data sharing is really critical, because that's where a number of other issues come up, including of data governance, which I'll talk about. Data curation, you need to validate, clean, curate the data. The quality assessment has to be there. And obviously, when we are talking of data sharing, it has to have the protocols for privacy and confidentiality in place. We have the DPDB Act in place. We have a Collection of Statistics Act, which talks of on what protocols need to be followed for aggregate data. And then I suppose data dissemination, which becomes ultimately the most important. That if we want that data to be usable for economic good, it has to be available in a publicly available form. And so these are the foundational pillars, and I've just given what building blocks exist, but it's not that in each of them it's complete. This is work in progress, that within the government we are working across ministries and working with the states and governments, states and union territories, so that at least government data follows these principles and data becomes AI ready as we move ahead. Uh, in this data harmonization that work that we are doing, uh, capacity building is an extremely important part of it, because understanding what is to be done, how it is to be done, is extremely important. And in fact, just in April we had a major kind of a conference with all states, and to just discuss these 6 pillars on what needs to be done by each and by when. And the different phases, there's a time frame that we have on ensuring that we achieve. Obviously, it will keep on expanding. We look at the priority data sets, and then look at other data sets as we continue to move ahead. Data dissemination, I'm just spending a little bit extra time. We are ensuring that there is no one single point of failure. We have a portal that we have, the website that we have, e-Sankhiki. There's Niti Aayog, which has the National Data Analytics Platform, and METI has an open data. All the data sets perhaps would be available across all 3 as we move ahead. Our focus is on a lot more on the government data. The OGD has a lot of other private sector data also, but which is not available on the Ministry of Statistics website. And we are by design keeping it that way, that if someone wants credible government data, there is it's where to look for, though it might also be available in the other platforms as we go ahead. We recently also added the MCP layer wrapper around our portal, so that LLMs can directly pick up that data. And the reason for doing that is that if the models don't get easy access to credible data, there'll be some other data filling up the gap. So we would want credible data to be available, whoever wants it, and these are all in the public domain in any case. So if that data is available, in fact, we were one of the first ones to have globally have an MCP on government data, and now, thank you. What use are we making of this convergence? And I think ultimately, if we are putting out this government data in the public domain, the ultimate aim for any government is that it has to improve public service delivery. Otherwise, the objective is, there could be a lot of other objectives for the private sector to develop products, but from our point of view, that's a collateral benefit. Our focus is obviously on public service delivery. And I'll just give a few examples of what has already been done. I'm sure many of you are aware of this Gati Shakti, where we have more than 1,700 layers of data. So if you want to plan out, if you want to implement where should the next primary health center be placed in so and so village, so the Gati Shakti platform, you can go out there, look at it, what's the closest primary health center, what are the other alternatives, what's the road connectivity out there, is there a school out there, is electricity available, etc., etc. So this is also helping the private sector in planning projects, and this is again in the public domain. and geospatial data is built into this. This is something which is really helping both the government and the private sector in project planning. Digi Yatra, I hope many of you have used it. It's something which is leading to reduction of time, and it's probably going to get connected with international other countries' systems also, so that it becomes seamless. Travel becomes so much more easy. And again, it's different data sets coming together. Some for the first time, Aadhaar for authentication, and then you do it later on based on local data. The Vahan dashboards is helping insurance. It's helping reduce insurance costs for people, and policies. It's so much faster, and the costs are reducing for people for vehicle insurance. This is across states. Jan Aadhaar, Kutumb, Parivar Pehchan, Samagra, where in order to identify people for specific programs that the governments are running. For example, recently Maharashtra on women for providing Ladki. I'm forgetting the name of that program, but sorry, Ladki. That's right. So for that, because you had this data sets available, you could identify and implement programs within a few weeks of announcement, which otherwise used to take a year or more. And it's also helping to ensure that there are no leakages, that type A, type 1, type 2 errors are not the people who are ineligible getting it, or eligible ones getting left out. And this is something which is only expanding as a number of states have done it, and it's leading to real benefits at the local level. There are a host of examples. I'm not going to run through others, but it's also helping monitoring. I think every Chief Minister's office has dashboards which are pulling together different data sets. But obviously, those data sets can be so much more useful if they are harmonized. It's like the plumbing for AI. I think the plumbing, and that plumbing very often we miss out, but it's so important. Sorry, I didn't realize I've run out of time. One more slide I have, and then this is a statistical business register, this is work in progress. We're going to have the economic census next year. This will help to identify supply chains, if you want to know where clusters of that work out. Obviously, in all these, I have not focused on or spoken about the privacy layer, but those layers have to be inbuilt, and that's what is being within the government systems. So whatever is in the public domain would be based on a consent architecture, so that it's there. So I'll stop here. This is, I think, a lot of the focus on this is also because of the Honorable Prime Minister's focus on, whenever he talks to civil servants, he talks to civil servants being experts in data-driven decision making in his assist. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
So I'm an academic who believes in death by PowerPoint. So I have actually written notes out here, but I think the Saurabh's talk was a perfect example of why we put together this workshop. Suresh, Manish, and I, we wanted to get these three worlds of academics, policymakers, and practitioners to collide. And I think all the researchers in the room, I think their eyes were lighting up looking at these data sources, because I wasn't even aware of these. And I'm sure a lot of other people aren't. And it would be good to get the education ecosystem that we have to work on these data sets and find interesting problems, both at the student level and at the research level, right? But our vision for this workshop was to get all of you together to try to address two of the hardest problems facing us, I think, globally, right? How do we ensure that the extraordinarily powerful capabilities now that we're seeing with AI, how do we ensure that these capabilities benefit humanity at scale and in an equitable manner? And second part is, how do we get India successfully on its journey to become a $10 trillion economy, and more importantly, perhaps a $10,000 per capita income economy, right? So I will argue that AI, if harnessed correctly, right, and we've gotten really good ideas today, and we're going to learn a lot more today and tomorrow. AI, if harnessed correctly, can be the wind in the sail of the ship that takes India to that destination out there, right? So let me start by talking a little bit about what we know from all the literature and the academics in the room who've been studying digital disruption and digital transformation for the last 30 to 40 years. Right. So when I talk to my MBA students, I remind them that this is actually not the first wave of technological disruption. Actually, by my count, we're in the seventh wave. I would put PCs and mainframes as sort of wave one. Next set of big IT investments were in ERP systems, right? So companies automating their processes. Following that, so now we're getting into the mid-90s. Following that, we had the dot-com revolution, and then we had, the social revolution in mobile and platform, and now we are at AI, right? And people have been studying how to get value from all of these for a long time. And there's one thing that we've learned that is consistent, is that the value, right? So if you're a firm and you want to invest in IT to get gains in productivity, it's not just a function of the technology itself. In fact, what's probably more important is what we call the organizational complements, right? What does that mean? It means that, take, for example, the story of General Mills, a company headquartered in Minneapolis, where I live, and Nestle, right? So two companies in a very similar domain, right? Make a lot of sugary food. Both these companies started installing SAP at the same point in time. One invested a lot in retraining their workforce, in redesigning their processes, in hiring the right set of leaders. And the other did not, because they thought it was a technological problem. The returns in terms of productivity and differentiation were disproportionate to the company that invested in these organizational complements, right? Let's talk about a local example, right? So if you think about Aadhaar, when Nandan envisaged Aadhaar, was fortunate enough to be part of those early days of thinking, it was not just sort of a technological solution, right? The more important aspect was the leadership that he showed when he walked essentially into the offices of 25 different state ministers, with all kinds of different political goals and parties and affiliations, and convinced them that, look, doesn't matter which party you belong to, this is actually going to be good for you, even politically, right? So if you can, have less friction in direct transfer of benefits, that's good. Doesn't matter whether you're in, the Congress or the TMC or BJP, right? So I think that set of organizational or societal complements, if you want to think at the national scale, becomes a key enabler to get value from technology, right? So here, Anindya talked about the AI stack. One uncomfortable truth we can talk honestly about is that India actually, look, if you're looking to invest in an AI company, there isn't an India company in that AI stack, right? But what does that mean? Manish made a video a couple of days ago, which basically said that, you don't have to build the car to drive it, right? What we have to build are the roads that take people to where they want to go, right? So I think this is where our story is going to play out. Just like with prior technologies, even with AI, we have to think of the right set of organizational complements, because every geography, every sort of, I would say region is going to face their own sets of challenges with respect to AI, right? There are existing inequalities, there's institutional inertia. So to give you a concrete example, I live in the city of Minneapolis. It's the northernmost city in the US. It's an icebox, and I come from Rajasthan, okay, which is a very arid desert climate out there, right? So last week, the Minneapolis City Council passed an ordinance banning any large data centers for the next 6 months, okay? And this was in response to a lot of concerns from citizens about the energy impact of these data centers, right? In particular, the impact on the water table and the impact on utility bills for consumers out there, right? So So if the demand for electricity spikes so much, right, what does that happen to consumers' bills, right? Now, I'm as big a tree hugger as you will find, okay, but I didn't really understand, that rationale in Minneapolis, right? Um, Minneapolis is in the state of Minnesota. In the US, if you've been driving around, you see states have logos. The logo for Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes. Okay. 3 hours from Minneapolis, we have Lake Superior, which is the world's largest, freshwater body. It's an ocean-sized lake, basically, out there, right? So if, my friends in Rajasthan were worried about the water table, I would buy that, right? That, this argument in Minneapolis, and not in different parts of the US, I'm sure this is a valid argument, but it didn't make sense in my context out there, right? And so I was wondering, like, what is missing out here, right? Because we also have a public school system that is severely underfunded, is not delivering, the city schools are not delivering the kind of education that they do. They don't have enough tax dollars. And I was thinking, is Pigou turning in his grave and, wondering why these council members don't understand, basically externalities and how we can, tax them and get welfare, right? So that is the kind of policy gap that exists actually everywhere. And if we don't start addressing these, we're not going to get the kind of value from AI, that we hope, right? So with respect to India, I pose the problem that we don't have a prominent place, a pole position in any dimension of the AI stack right now. But what we do have are two really, really important strengths. Okay, so I'm going to talk about where we can leverage our advantage, right? And this is going to be a stock and a flow story. Okay. So there are two kinds of capital, I think, that matter a lot. And the first is what I'll call a civilizational opening balance. Okay, so this is the stock. What am I talking about out here? So let's look at the lens of, Maslow's hierarchy of, human needs, right? I think it's fair to say that in India, we probably don't, do really well in, the level 1, level 2, roti, kapda, makan, food, shelter, housing. Or maybe even, safety and governance, the physiological needs and the safety and governance. Those are level 1 and level 2, okay? Somehow, due to our, history and our civilizational sort of, ethos, we actually do, no economic model would predict the fact that we actually do really well in some level 3 measures, right? What is level 3? Level 3 is love and belonging, right? It's about social connections. It's about family ties. It's about the community structures that I see here to be sort of, again, at a if you look at that model, the model doesn't fit in some senses, right? It doesn't make sense. In fact, the level 6 of the model is self-transcendence, it's spirituality. We probably score maybe highest in the world in that, right? But we don't have perhaps the basics, right? But this is important, okay? These are not just soft assets. I think these this stock of civilizational capital that we have is actually a buffer against technological disruptions, right? I think we might have a much, I would say, weaker labor market shock due to AI because we have this other, kind of social capital that we can rely on. Okay. And I would argue that it's actually this stock that has led to the second flow argument that I'm going to make, which is basically the ability to create these population scale digital public infrastructures, right? Again, I was talking about, the kind of leadership, for example, that Nandan talked about earlier, that, allowed a country to build, a biometric identity. This freaks people out, by the way. When I talk about this in the US, it's like they're scanning like your fingerprints, they got your retina scan or your irises, your eye scan in a government database, that's kind of crazy. But here, we managed to pull that out. And so now we have this DPI kind of flow, successful public digital infrastructure. And as we've learned already, it's not finished yet, right? It's only the Aadhaar, UPI, the GST, the FASTag, the ABM stack is the foundation, and you can see where the vision of this is going, right? So each of these, in my opinion, is a very interesting policy achievement. This DPI rail, is going to serve us really, really well. And I would say that basically, the long and short of that is that we can really, play above average in the application layer, right? So with this if we use our advantages, we know how to build these systems at scale, not only from the IT services movement that we've been champions of, but also at the national level, right? Which again hasn't been done anywhere. This will allow us to tackle, the grand global challenges, educating the global South. A lot of us here in the room are doing work on bringing AI, education in a responsible way into the classroom, right? Making sure that it's a coach, not a crutch, right? We want to make sure that AI does not lead to cognitive surrender and people stop thinking, but actually we have to build in that, a level of friction into the process, constructive friction, so that actually it can fulfill this dream of personalized learning journeys for students. I'm really excited about the potential of the Ayushman Bharat, medical database, essentially, right? So if you think about healthcare, eradicating disease from the planet, if this rolls out and if it follows all the principles that Secretary was talking about, where it's it's curated well and it will become the largest repository of medical histories anywhere in the world, right? So think of the potential of that combined with AI enabled drug discovery with the existing assets that Manish has written about in his book around the pharma industry. We could be the leader in the world in reducing the time from molecule to patient, right? I mean, I think that's a big opportunity. And then finally, I think the idea behind this conference and the center at NCAER that Suresh was talking about, that we're envisaging, transforming governance in a data-driven decision-making way, transforming policy, thinking of sort of the underlying research that has to come out and support this, right? So I think there's lots of room for opportunity to take this exhaust stream of data and do all kinds of very interesting things, right? And just to sort of share one slice of how this new type of data might yield insights that we didn't have earlier, I'll continue with my building the road analogy and talk about a project actually that was funded by Shomik, who's from the World Bank, and it's essentially a study that was published by Sam Asher and Paul Novosad in the American Economic Review. And the question they were asking was around the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana initiative, where $40 billion were spent to connect rural villages to paved roads. Okay, so big investment funded partially by the government, partially by the World Bank, goes in. So what do we get out of it as a society, right? So that was a very good question, I think, that Sam and Paul got deep into, published a paper in AER. And what they found was two things, right? So the main finding was that it does integrate the workers who live in these villages to non-farm work, right? So kind of the transition, one of the transitions that Manish talks a lot about is farm to non-farm. So actually the road investments help with that. But the AER paper also finds that there wasn't any significant effect on agricultural productivity, on household income, and on consumption. Okay, and the consumption part is what I'll double click on a little bit. Now, Shomik was telling me this morning that there are other papers that have looked at the same data and have found much more interesting positive effects. For example, in reducing mortality of children or at birth time. So that's a separate story. But let me focus on consumption for a second. So the metric that paper was using to capture consumption was nighttime lights, right? So we have Jonathan Hirsch here, who studied, nighttime lights a lot, and this is work that I'm doing right now with Arhan and Vandit from ISB. And one of the things that we started looking at was we started asking, is there a better way to measure consumption at the village level than just looking at the intensity, the photon intensity that can be measured by satellites, right? By the way, this is standard in a lot of top economic journals, right? So, which is what people are using. So I would argue that, the nighttime light intensity is a very good stock measure. It's the best that we have. I wouldn't say it's a very good measure. I think it's the best that we have kind of measure, which is good, right? So good should not be the enemy of great. But it misses out, right? It is a stock measure because we can tell you at this point in time, this is probably a proxy for the consumption activity, but it misses out underneath on what's happening, in that kirana shop, the small shop in the village, right? And this is where we started looking at the pulse data from PhonePe, which is based on the UPI, data public infrastructure stack, right? So PhonePe has been, I think, and I think Mr. Chari will be here tomorrow. I don't know if he's in the room. but PhonePe has been publishing more granular, more aggregate data than we as researchers would like. So this is the conversation we'll have with them. But PhonePe has been publishing, basically aggregated UPI data at the district level, and we thought that this would be a very good proxy for actually measuring consumption. And what we found was that in the nighttime light data set, so we basically constructed a data set across 6 years, I think, for all the Indian districts. Both the nighttime light data, we constructed that, and the PhonePe data side by side. In the nighttime light data, only 3.2% of the variance in that entire data set is within the district. Okay, so if you look at that, basically, you will and you find that there is no effect of, let's say, the road on consumption. It could be because of two things. It could be because there is no effect in reality, or it could be that your data does not have the signal to pick that up, right? So in contrast, the PhonePe pulse data, 52% of the variance in that data is within the district. So these districts are growing. There is consumption happening out there, right? It's just that we could not see it with the old data set, which we will be able to see with the new data set, right? So I think that's the type of research opportunities that are out there. I think, I'm sure in the other panels we'll talk. We have to take these ideas and take them beyond research into the classroom, into our educational system. So I was really excited by all the ideas so far, and looking forward to this conversation. So thank you all for coming, and welcome to the workshop.
So Krishnan's on his way. He's not here yet. So maybe we'll get started with the panel and we'll sort of interrupt it there. So I'm sure all of you have questions. I have questions. Do you have any questions for each other? Not really? Okay. Bapu, just Ravi, when you said that we sort of missed the AI bus and that's a source of angst right now. So in AI generation, we're not there. But without being in AI generation, you think we could be there in AI deployment? Or is this path dependent and you're sort of, you can't jump on the train after it's left the station?
No, I think we can be. Now, there is good work happening. The India-specific problem out here was alluded to earlier, which is the language problem, right? So these OpenAI is not investing in Marathi or in Jharkhandi or whatever languages, right? So Nandan and others have funded good projects at IIT Madras and others that are making sure that these we have the training data in those local languages that can use the existing models and fine tune them. So I think that's the only missing link. But I think people here, smart people, already recognize that. They've already invested in it. So I don't see it's a big barrier, actually. So I think
you have a theory on why DeepSeek came out of China and not out of India?
So this is a bigger question around, I think, our research ecosystem, right? I think which we can talk about. I'm happy to get into that, but I think there are other panels and discussions that are focusing on that as well. But I think if you look at, we're talking about research out here, right? If you just look at the quantity of research that's coming out of China, right? Now, not all of this is high quality, right? But it is order of magnitudes higher than any other country in the world, including the US actually right now, right? We are not playing that game. So the Indian, you're on the board of Ashoka, there are many people here from ISB. So we have pockets of excellence, but we don't have the University of Minnesota, which is a state university, right? It's not MIT, it's not Stanford, but we have Nobel laureates coming out of the University of Minnesota, right? So I think for me, that's the big structural gap that, the government has to address and private sector has to address, I think, for me, yeah.
So Saurabh, in a government that is organized vertically, the biggest challenge is horizontals, right? Manufacturing is a problem, urbanization is a problem, skills is a problem, because these are horizontals, across all ministries. And if we think that ministries are territorial physically, digital silos are worse than physical silos right now, right? And we don't even have a single source of truth for laws. How will you get to a single source of truth for government on stock and on flow after you're gone? How do we institutionalize this rather than sort of depend on your manual labor?
So I think technology is something which is helping to ensure that we automatically get de-siloed. And I'll just give you one example, and it may not be the only way to do it, but for example, you talk of having these data portals available at one place. Because of the technology that the data should reside with the owner, and all that you need is an API to access it and have it automatically available at another place. So there are solutions available which may
Come, sir. Sorry, we started the panel because we were yes, data. Maybe we'll put you back at the end again.
So, number one, there would be technological solutions which may not be applicable across, but there would be which will help cut the silos across dimensions. The second is institutional, and I think that is something, for example, the government now has what is called a sectoral group of secretaries, so that each group, let's say health, so all departments working in that are part of one sectoral group. And that's how there would need to be institutional solutions to take care of the silos which exist. But there would be institutional solutions, there would be technological solutions, and more importantly, I think it's at the delivery of services uh, where the combining across departments automatically has to happen, because as the metrics for measure for performance, or metrics for measurement, is on delivery of public services, that's what will ensure that the necessary cutting across silos is done.
But do we need multiple identities? You talked about 24. Do we need 24 identities for citizens? Do we need 23 identities?
Yeah.
I mean, there is a sectoral case for that, or there is just a territorial case for that?
So, I mean, I've been a CEO in Aadhaar,
Ah, exactly. That's why I'm asking.
and so we've examined this in that, and I think we had to make a balance between privacy and need for dissemination of about identity. The common suggestion is that why can't you make Aadhaar as the across all, and that becomes the only identity. Uh, what was seen was that Aadhaar has also become uh, the link for payments, for everything. Aadhaar is there, and there are people are slightly apprehensive of having their Aadhaar numbers in the public domain everywhere. So that's why a second layer was built on top of it, and everything is linked back to the Aadhaar, but you need that access, and which will be governed by a mechanism, so that if you want to trace back if there's any fraudulent activity which has been done. And I think it was to ensure that the concerns about privacy are met, and for the public facing part, you have a education number which is there, you have an Ayushman health identity number which is there, you have a driving license, you have a passport, but all of these at the back end are linked to the Aadhaar, so that uh, when needed, if there is a requirement for the individual, Aadhaar would suffice to be able to get all those multiple identities. But at the same time, not to expose the Aadhaar in the public domain. In the public domain, you will have these 20 identities which can't be linked by anyone without their access. So I suppose it's a requirement, and sometimes the ideal is always not the best solution. You have to look at what is the next to ideal, and then work forward from there.
So what I'll do is I'll just finish my one question for everybody, then we'll hear Krishnan, and then I'll open up to all of you. So Anindya, I wanted to ask you, and probably no point in asking a barber if you need a haircut. I mean, given I heard your presentation on Meta and Google, but don't you think there is something, forget policy, forget law, about the winner takes all in digital markets? There are network effects where there are no points for second place. And you're saying that no, you somehow define markets for Meta in ways that they only had 20% market share and 28% for Google. Um, isn't there something structural about the digital world different from the physical world, where monopolies are sort of harder? I mean, it requires collusion that leaves digital footprints, but there's something structural about Google having such a huge percentage of search, and then and that many other areas. So and this is important for, will that happen in AI, or is AI not winner take all, maybe a substitute?
Yeah, so I guess there's maybe two ways to think about this. One is condition on the current antitrust laws. What is it that plaintiffs can allege, and what is it the defendants can prove? That's one part to it. The other part that is relevant is, should there be actually changes in the antitrust laws, which would then look at maybe a different set of issues, different set of metrics. Now, so the first point is, what is factually true is, yes, there are potential network effects, there's potential, switching costs, etc. But despite all of that, what is also true is that consumers do multi-home and consumers do gravitate towards multiple choices and options. And so um, what that leads to is a scenario where, if you start essentially looking at data, despite being theoretically the idea that it's true that there may be two players that are really controlling the market, turns out actually that's not true. So in other words, what we found in these antitrust cases is, when you look at the data, condition on the way antitrust laws are defined, which means condition on how you define the market, turns out that it is true that these companies have far less than 70% market share. Some of that is essentially the fact that when consumers are able to multi-home, they're essentially manifesting that we are okay using multiple options, multiple choices, right? So that's the first part. The second part is, should there be a change in the way antitrust laws are actually thought of? Okay, and maybe that's an interesting question. So one thing that we've come across in recent sort of policy discussions in DC is, when you look at these larger tech companies, Apple, Amazon, Google, Meta, all their services are provided free of cost, right? In other words, consumers don't have to pay a subscription fee. However, an argument to be made is, the data that is generated by consumers on these platforms is a fee that they pay. So if you are essentially the product, so the data is your price. That has not been fully baked in the current antitrust laws, either in Europe or in Asia Pacific or in the US. If that does get baked in, so I think the next generation of antitrust laws, especially in the context of AI, which is, as alluding to earlier, is I expect them to bake that argument. And then, in addition to what we looked at, I imagine whoever the experts are, will have to look at an additional set of metrics. Because if it's true that data is the price that you pay, then maybe there should be some benefits passed back to a broader ecosystem. Yeah.
Okay. Just last one question for you, ma'am. Then we'll listen. There is some such thing as premature load bearing in regulation, right? So driving license weren't issued till cars stabilized for 50 years. That may have been too long. But lately, I've been thinking about, how did China become 1/3 of new drugs in the world? Why didn't DeepSeek come from India? Is a question I've been asking. And and China is now going to allow autonomous driving in 200 cities at one go, right? They're going to skip what the US did, and they're going to allow them to do much more. So they might break ahead, right? And obviously, their clinical trial regime is different from India's, which is why, in a hospital with 5 people, you can do all that. How do you think about this versus, say, has Europe done premature load bearing, and that's why they don't have innovation on they don't have any they're a digital wasteland, if not an economic wasteland. But at least digitally they don't have. So is that a child, you think, of this mentality of, we need to protect consumers, we need to, and then innovation just gets stopped? And how do you think about that from a competition perspective? Regulation is obviously upstream from competition, but in AI, I think it's happening simultaneously.
So, in my talk also, I was mentioning that, when we look at competition and the impact various technology developments are happening in the markets, we're always keeping innovation in mind, that we have to strike a balance between innovation and consumer welfare. So the way the Europe has looked at is more towards consumer protection. And but in India, we do have a very strong and robust startup ecosystem which we want to protect. And some of the measures which have been taken recently, which are the amendments which have happened in the Competition Act, like the deal value, which is looking at killer acquisitions. So those are the ways we are trying to protect competition, also allowing innovation to thrive and ensuring that anti-competitive things don't happen in the markets. So that is the approach we are following in India, which is a mix of both what is happening in the US and what is required as per our local ecosystem, as per our Indian ecosystem.
Okay. Ask Krishnan if you could give your remarks. You want to do it from here or go there, whatever you'd like. Yeah, that's good.
I think, let me first apologize for not being here at the time that I was supposed to, because I could have had the advantage of hearing all the other speakers, which is important. I mean, for what they would have had to say, you've collected a real galaxy of experts in the area. So it would have been very useful for me in my present job to actually hear them all. But more importantly, I think even to sort of be relevant and not repeat what many of them would have said for this audience. So I will just keep the opening remarks very brief. The original topic I was given was AI and DPI as game changers for Indian electronics. And I was sort of mentally struggling a bit with the idea of, AI and DPI and then electronics as a separate element. Because the way that India, I think in the first time around, addressed it, and are there lessons there that electronics we gave free access, and under the ITA there were no tariffs at all, and a lot of it got imported. So many people in the electronic industry turned around and said that just killed the electronics industry in India. The people who would make computers and laptops and possibly not laptops at that point, but computers and various other devices at that time. But if you looked at it another way, maybe the IT revolution itself would not have taken place, and you wouldn't have almost $300 billion of revenue being generated in IT and IT-enabled services had there not been access to IT hardware devices as freely, and had that been restricted. So you could argue it either way. And at this point now, when we are trying to build the electronic story all over again, and importantly, we are building it because one, as a large market, you want to have resilience. And resilience, I think, recent history proves is extremely important for a number of reasons. One, that there could be some sort of disruption which will disrupt actual output. And if you become over-reliant on one source of supply, then it could start affecting you. So that's resilience is a key element for India and for any other part of the world. The second is, when you're such a large market and so reliant on various devices, then you also need to have some degree of strategic autonomy, because you can't afford to have kill switches and other things outside the country, and you need to have some degree of strategic control on many of the applications, and many of those are hardware layer. And the third is a pure security point in terms of what comes in and what goes out, what are the kind of backdoors which are there, and this is a concern not just for India but all over the world. I mean, Europe is doing it, the Americans do it, and we've started doing it in some sectors. Telecom, obviously, we do it. We have started doing it for CCTV cameras. We may have to expand it to a few more areas, particularly in the context of AI, because AI would depend a lot on collecting a lot of data. And if you're really looking at the way that AI would extend into real world, real sectors of the economy, if it's manufacturing or if it's agriculture or any of these areas, then it would really mean that a lot of the data collection is done by sensors and various other IoT devices, and then that needs to be analyzed and looked at, and a variety of things need to be done there. So both from an industrial espionage perspective and from an overall strategic perspective, it's important that you have some degree of understanding and control and that you know that these devices, and most of them end up being black boxes, you're sure that they come from a trusted and verified source so that you're not getting into trouble. So from that context, and the fact that, even when we talk about DPIs, that is becoming an area of concern. If you're looking at Aadhaar and the way that Aadhaar is used, and currently a lot of the use for identification and verification is actually on the basis of OTPs which get delivered, and that is the most common mode of service. But increasingly, we find that given a lot of cybercrime that takes place, the problem is really with the OTPs, and the newest confidence trick is to call somebody in, ask for an OTP, get it, and then cheat them. So we are looking at more face authentication or biometric authentication through a range of devices. Then the minute you get into a device being used to do that, then again, you're getting back into the security concerns, privacy concerns, and all the backward linkages there. So this is the context in which I think both for DPIs and for AI, the integrity of the electronic systems and the way that that runs is becoming more and more important and relevant. So for a country like India, where increasingly, for instance, if you looked at, we are a mobile first country, there are more than 1 billion people who access the internet in India. Almost 95% of them access it through mobile phones. I mean, that is the most common mode of access. So which then means that over time, do you need to seriously look at, what these devices are all about? Of course, we are proud of the fact that in the last 10 to 12 years, you've been able to sort of make sure that almost every mobile phone which is sold in the country is finally manufactured here, finally assembled here. Although we have some way to go in terms of value addition and some way to go in terms of the upstream manufacture element of many of these mobile phones. But even then, I mean, you're not 100% sure, because if the active components are coming from elsewhere, you're not 100% sure that they are secure in every sense. So these are all, I think, critical elements for the electronics industry. And when you rely on mobile phones as the primary device through which a lot of your transactions run, lot of the economy, the digital economy itself runs, then it becomes important to start looking at these elements. Thus far, our basic objective has been that, as far as possible, don't fiddle with the consumer end devices, those which are under ITA1. I mean, laptops, tablets, and a variety of other devices anyway come in free of any duties. Mobile phones, we have a slightly different regime. We make them here. There again, don't fiddle too much with what happens in terms of, don't place onerous security requirements on those. But then look at all the devices which come into networks and all the devices which collect public data. I mean, those which are in consumer hands, okay, to some extent you can individually take care of what your concerns are. But those which are in public spaces, those which are used on a more generalized basis, how you take care of the security concerns is something which is relevant. So 3 sets of concerns, as I said, and in all 3 areas, I think it's important. And from a pure economic perspective, we are still a country which, the big question to be answered is, in the development transition, is China the last country which moved the classical way from agriculture to manufacturing to services? And are we going to bypass manufacturing altogether? If we believe that we will not bypass manufacturing altogether, then you have to be there in a big way in electronics manufacture, simply because it is today probably the largest single manufacturing sector in the world. So how do you not have a presence, especially when you expect that consumers in India will be one of the biggest market for many of these electronic devices. So from any perspective that you look at it, electronics becomes important. Electronics manufacture in the country becomes important. And that's precisely what we are attempting to do through a range of our policy interventions, whether you looked at the phase management program previously, whether you looked at the production-linked incentive schemes. Of the 14, the most successful one, which sort of met many of its production and investment and employment-linked goals, was the was the one which was intended for large-scale electronic manufacture, that is mobile phones. And we have another one which is running for IT hardware, so far not as successful. We've launched and currently implementing one which is meant for electronic component manufacturing scheme, which seems extremely promising because what it does is it increases the value addition that takes place in the country. Now, that's important for two reasons. One, that the industry continues to stay grounded in India, because if you have an industry which, a lot of people tell me that the PLI for mobile phones, yeah, successful, all very good, but you're just putting together these instruments. You're just sort of assembling this. So what's the big deal? I wouldn't scoff at it for the simple reason that the factories which assemble the mobile phones are today the largest factories in the country in terms of employment. That is where the largest employment is. That is where the jobs are. And that is where this is truly happening. Of course, we have to increase value addition, and we have to increase value addition so that the jobs in the assembly continue. We continue to be competitive as a location where the assembly also takes place. So we need to continue to be competitive there. Therefore, to actually source more of what goes into the phones within the country is important. And of course, linked. So this is one reason why I think electronics requires focus. Electronics is part of the industry in the future. And I started with the resilience point. If you have 60% of electronics manufacture happening in only one country, I think for the world, it's a problem. You really need to have more of it happening elsewhere as well. Linked to that, very similar for that very same reason, is what is happening in the semiconductor space. We may be late on the ground, we may be late getting there, but clearly semiconductors, again, a foundational industry. Anywhere in the world that they've come up on the back of government subsidies and government grants. They've not been established without those. We are attempting to do the same. I'm often questioned saying, but then, you're doing legacy nodes, you're doing mature nodes which are well-established technologies. What is the big deal about that? It's already available. They're all commoditized chips. So why are you doing this? And why aren't you at the cutting edge? Now, I think the logic there is very simple. And the funding that we have available to support this is naturally limited. That is, I think we need to recognize that we're still not a rich country. We are a large economy. We are a large country, but resources are still constrained as to where you can put the money on. So resources are constrained as to what we can bet on in the semiconductor sector. Again, for reasons of strategic depth, for reasons of resilience, we have to be there. We can't not be in that segment. So the logical place to start is where you can make do with the least amount of subsidies and least amount of grants. At the same time, when you do not have advanced manufacturing skills in the country, start with where the technology is mature and you can actually succeed. So back something that will work and you can succeed. And third, organically grow from there. So this is no country has done this journey in a 5-year or a 10-year time span. It has taken a couple of decades, 2 or 3 decades to actually get there. So I think the strategy there also is very clear. Start with the mature nodes, develop capacities in terms of advanced manufacturing, start researching that areas, support the companies and others who are working in that space to move forward in that space so that eventually in about a couple of decades' time, we do reach the advanced or more cutting edge nodes. So this is broadly the way we look at the entire electronics play. Now, clearly, we've used technology, particularly DPIs, as a way to cut through a lot of the delivery constraints on what governments and even the private sector can do, and it's been a success story. Now, AI, along with DPI, is the next sort of big space that we need to look at. Today, of course, a lot of people say, okay, you've lost out in the race and you're not, you don't have one of those maybe 15, 20 companies in the world which actually do the real cutting edge work in the AI infrastructure. So clearly, we need to distinguish this. All the companies we are speaking about now as big investors, and maybe winner takes all, maybe one or two, are all still the AI infrastructure companies. Ultimately, the revenue and the money and the impact lies in the guys who actually use the AI, use that technology and make it applicable to real world applications. And I think that is a space where India can still play. Um, I'll just give you one anecdote. A couple of weeks ago, the Prime Minister hosted a lunch for the visiting Cypriot president. And I happened to be at the same table as an Indian entrepreneur who runs something called Sappang Labs. So I was just curious and I asked him, saying, how come you ended up in this lunch for the Cypriot president? He said, no, actually, I was, and there's another few other people from Cyprus at that same table. So he says, no, you see, I was in the India AI Summit and I had a stall which was showcasing whatever AI related developments, AI and cybersecurity related developments that we had created. So the equivalent of the principal scientific advisor of Cyprus, who was also at the table at lunch, apparently saw him there, met him there, and sort of took him back. And this is February, and now this was the end of May. So took him back to Cyprus, and he got this opportunity to actually build the AI and cybersecurity stack for Cyprus. So the thing really is that the applications of where AI is going to be used is probably still the space where India can make that big difference. And I think we need to stay focused there and not get very worried. Clearly, we need the infrastructure. We have to make sure that we provide the infrastructure. We have to get the chips in place. You would find that when the India Semiconductor Mission Phase 2 comes up, there is an attempt to also focus on AI-related chips in terms of where we can build the stack all the way from there. Clearly, also, we need models of our own for strategic, for cultural, linguistic, and a range of reasons. And again, strategic simply because you can't have kill switch on the model not in India. So we are focusing on the models. And the one thing that we have in fair amount of plenty is data. And Saurabh and I, of course, we work together on making sure that the data platforms work. It is hard work. It is probably the hardest work amongst the three to actually get people to agree to share data, give it in the format that you need. But I think every week I keep updating how many data sets are there in the AI Kosh platform. They've crossed close to 12,000 at last count, so that keeps increasing. But making available these machine-readable data sets and things for innovators out of India so that they can use that more effectively is the other part of this. So I think, in a sense, if I really had to look at it, a country the size of India needs to build the whole stack. And the country with the sort of skill sets that Indians have, particularly in the ITES industry, is a country that can actually provide at least some of these to the rest of the world. And that's really the model that we should be looking at. And that's part of the way that we are strategizing, at least in this area. So let me finish there. Thanks.
So just this learning by doing, which you implied, which I completely agree with, right? A healthy baby is not born an adult, right? There's a learning by doing. And your cadre, Tamil Nadu, is now overtaking Gujarat in manufacturing, at least from my vantage point. And that's been a spectacular sort of poverty reduction story. It's a spectacular inclusion story. And there's so many things about that which apply. But do you ask the question, like it's like I don't let pharma go, right? Because I paid them respects by writing a book about them, but 60% of volume and only 6% of value, right, of the global pharma industry. So the world can't live without the manufacturing side of pharma, but it can live without India on the innovation. But China went to 1/3 of new medicines, right? And then a few years ago, we exported more software than Saudi Arabia did oil. But yet DeepSeek came out of China. Do you have, not from your this position, how do you reflect on the innovation ecosystem? You think it's getting to critical mass? As you said, we may be fourth in total GDP, but we're 128th in per capita GDP. So you can't expect 128th to act like we're richer than we are. So how do you think of this jump starting of the innovation? Because we're economically more complex than our per capita GDP would suggest.
I agree with you entirely. You see, part of the problem, and I think this is a question that I've asked many of the IT majors and other companies who've come and met me, saying that there's this whole notion of how do we become a product nation? How do we sort of, I mean, even this phone, if you take, for instance, probably it costs $1,000 in the US. The bill of materials cost when it goes out of India is probably about $250. And, somebody sitting there who has the IP, somebody sitting there who's done the design is the one who's making most money off of this. And clearly, in our software industry, this is the problem. But when you talk to them, they tell you that, look, when I do a services operation in software, I have a clear, safe margin of 20%. It's a safe, stable business, and I make this. If I get into products, it may sell. If it sells, then I make a huge margin. I mean, it sort of compensates for everything. But if it doesn't sell, then the risk is also equally huge in terms of all the other expenditure that I've incurred. So that mindset of not wanting to take a very big risk is a problem. And I think the same mindset dictates the kind of expenditure which happens on research and development in India. I mean, everyone is fond of saying this. 0.7% is your expenditure, of which 0.6% of GDP is what comes from the government. So what the private sector is putting down on research is just about 0.1%. So clearly, there's a reluctance to make these bets. They don't trust themselves to make the bet. But to some extent, I think it is changing. There are enough companies who are thinking about how do you make products. For instance, within electronics, in the hearables and wearables segment, we have Indian companies who are now willing to design and make products. We have some Indian companies who are now designing laptops. There are companies who are actually designing final products and making them. I think a lot more of that needs to happen. And likewise, I mean, software services may be a thing of the past in, say, 10 years from now in the way that you look at it. So you have to, I think it has to be applications and solutions, which means that, the companies which sort of just hand out and do the back end operations now have to go there and sort of solve bigger problems and give applications and solutions to whoever they are. So, whoever their clients are. And that's where the pivot really needs to take place in that industry, because that's what they'll expect. They'll expect that otherwise, if it's just a back end operation, they'll do it with AI. So, the way you deploy it for the organization and the way you will sort of make it suit what the organization needs is truly the story. So, which means that we have to even start thinking about how you want to sort of educate the next round of people, and what is it that they need, what are the skills that they will need, and what is the extent of domain knowledge they will need of specific spaces where AI is going to be applied. So that's a whole separate debate altogether.
Okay, I'll open it up. If any one of you have questions, I have lots of questions, but if any one of you have any questions, happy to. Yeah, all right. Right here, the front and then in the back there.
Let's see if this is on. Okay, all right. Actually, my question is for you, Dr. Sabharwal. I really enjoyed your remarks. I learned a ton. Thank you. Anything from generals to GDP to venomous snakes. But my question is the following, and I think it's a hard one, so I don't have an answer. As you expand the footprint of the digital public infrastructure, increasing the capacity of government, how is it that you increase and ensure that the DPI is truly for the benefit of the public as opposed to those in power? And to give you an example, even from my own country at the moment that I find challenging, is that digital infrastructure is now being used to alter voting rolls and also apply ideological litmus tests to the investment in science. So I guess I ask the question, how do we make sure that digital public infrastructure is genuinely for the public good as opposed to those in power? And that could apply to government or to companies themselves.
Let me give Saurabh a chance to answer that. No, I'll give all three of them because they have dealt, and I'm happy to pitch in with.
So I think obviously there need to be broad protocols and guidelines which have to be in place, which will guide the usage of DPI. And some of them, I think, are in any case uh, very focused on areas on which are public service delivery. But I suppose what you are alluding to is the fact like a Digi Yatra having a photograph or the biometrics of that person, and that being used in purposes for which it is not supposed to be. And I think that the main way of doing it would have to be built in by the means of either regulation or by legislation. And that would need to be ensured that it's actually being used for the purpose for which it is meant to be. Beyond that, uh, I think the artificial constructs of a legislation and regulation are meant for that. And if there's a violation of those, there has to be a mechanism to take care of that. But I don't think I have I really can't add more than that. Is there? No, I think it is a very valid question, saying you don't want something which is not intended for public good masquerading as something which then gets imposed from top, and that I think is is an essential democratic principle. I mean, at every time that there is a service which is offered on this basis, I think there has to be robust questioning as to what the intent is and is it really serving the purposes that it is intended to. And at least insofar as the way that the data gets used, I think to some extent the Digital Personal Data Protection Act does offer some protection in the sense that the data, at least in the Indian principle, belongs to the data principal. He owns or she owns the data, and you can use it, and the purposes for which you use it is limited by the terms of the consent. So, to some extent, there is a safeguard. It's a question of how aware people are and what kind of things they give consent to, and how do you sort of make sure that it doesn't get misused. The same point that was made earlier, this balance between where you need innovation and where technology takes you further, and the way that you safeguard certain other interests which are important. So that is the balance we have attempted to strike. The act is yet to come into full operational this thing, giving all the companies enough time to build up their infrastructure to enable the consent mechanism to operate. But I think that will offer a true test of how people perceive this and whether it really acts in their interest. Because today, the way it works, I mean, it's not people in power necessarily, but the way it works is that, at least in India, people are very, very willing to share data and many times over and unnecessary data too. So,
I just have one point to add to this. This was one of the very important concerns when we were looking at the WhatsApp Meta case. And in fact, when we were looking at remedies, so the thing which was coming from the side of the enterprise was that we have already taken consent, because that consent was built into those terms and conditions of service, which you are required to accept. So we said, no, I mean, like, that's what everybody is doing. That's what every person who is doing any kind of business will try and get consent like that. So one of the remedies we clearly said was that the WhatsApp will give a clear in-app notification. It will not be masked in the terms and conditions of service. So you will have to very clearly say, I accept the service and I accept my data sharing. So those kind of things will have to be very clearly given. I think if we can empower the citizens, make them more aware, rather than allowing these things to happen through those footnotes and those terms and conditions which are running with a 7 font, which one can't even read and doesn't even have the time to go through that length of the whole thing. I think that's the way forward I look at it. So gradually, if we can move towards that, that might be the solution.
I just have a few reactions. I don't think private versus public is the same problem, right? Google probably knows more about our citizens than the government. So, or Meta or WhatsApp. And so we need to be clear that this applies not just to public digital public rights, it's also for private. Second is a complicated argument of life is second best at best. I've been making this argument about regulation. I'm part of this new deregulation committee. On the most expensive school is no school. The most expensive power is no power, right? And a bad school is better than no school. But we prematurely have put so much regulation in place that we don't allow education entrepreneurs who are technocrats to raise money. You have to be non-profit. So you're basically either a crook or a politician or a landlord to be an education entrepreneur in India, because regulatory arbitrage is your key skill. So I think we have to be careful with the premature load bearing, and DPI is voluntary. We have guardrails. It will be tested. And that'll bring me to my third point. My favorite book is In Defense of Democracy, In Defense of Politics by Bernard Crick, 1962, where he said, we all don't like politicians, but we love democracy. But before politicians, we used to kill each other. And now we call each other names, we do misinformation. But that is how society intermediates and indicates its choices, right? So let's trust our democracy. I know in the US it feels like climate change, but it's a passing shower. I believe it's a passing shower for the US from far away. And I think we should believe that democracy will punish the companies or the politicians or the technocrats who use this data to target people based on religion or identity or something else. Nisha?
Good morning, I'm Anindya. I'm new to NCAER. It's the director of the Center of Health Economics. Question for you, actually for the whole panel, is regarding, we've talked a lot about the details and the technological side of AI, right? And one, I think, big piece that really needs immediate focus, especially in India, if indeed the train has left the station on AI, is the behavioral side of it. I know from my kids' school, from being a health scientist myself, that AI is almost being stigmatized, or perhaps even a self-stigma for using it in education as a shortcut, in health as becoming your own MD or MBBS, right? Everybody's diagnosing themselves. We saw this through the pandemic, a lot of the misuse. So maybe just for the panelists, beyond the chips and the technology, the behavioral component, like how is India and Indians, how are they going to respond to the use of AI, right? Have we already in India reached a point where people have stigmatized it, or is everybody on the bandwagon to say, yes, this is a companion and this is something to help us with our healthcare, with our agency, with our, rights?
Do you want to take that? I think in India we worry about the loving embrace rather than the stigmatization. But go ahead.
I was going to start by saying that Ravi and I wrote a book that's in everybody's packet that has 2 chapters on both healthcare and education. The reason we started thinking about this book is precisely goes back to the question you asked, which is, a lot of the discussions and narrative about AI has been very negative. It's been very cynical, it's very skeptical, starting from, it's unfair, it's going to take all jobs away, et cetera, et cetera. And while some of that is true, it's also true that there's a lot of upside that has come out of AI. And so I think, when we wrote the book, the real motivation was to start this conversation so that people get both sides of the narrative rather than just one side of it. We sort of, talk about a lot of actual examples where AI has had huge impact on improving education across levels, from personalized education to access to more tools for people who don't have access to that before, like LLMs are actually making meaningful differences in young people's lives in a variety of ways. I think like with every technology, it's a conversation because you're not going to be able to convince everybody at the same time. So it's going to be a staggered adoption from that perspective. So both of us are pretty optimistic. I'll let Ravi speak for himself, but we are very optimistic that eventually more people will see the light of the day on the positives of AI, while keeping in mind some of the important guardrails that are necessary. Even with the use of things like LLMs, it can be used or misused, just like any other technology. So I think it's a combination of, conversation starting from the household, but also helped by regulation, helped by influential people talking about the positives of this. And just related to that, and maybe Manish, can I take a very quick stab at your DeepSeek question, because it's been like you asked that question a few times. So very quickly, the answer to your DeepSeek question, why it did not come out of any other country except China, is and don't take this the wrong way, but it's actually a answer is jingoism. So let me explain what I mean by that. So between 2013 and 2017, I was head of data science for 3DI in Shanghai, which was at that time the largest mobile system integrator. We actually sold our company to WPP. That role took me to China 5 or 6 times a year. And over time, I ended up going, I don't know, like 35 times to the country. I spent a lot of time with the engineers in Tsinghua and Fudan and Beijing Institute of Technology, etc. And I often used to ask them was one question, like, what drives you? And literally the most unanimous answer I would get across the board is, we don't want to lose to the Americans in the AI arms race, period. So that is a answer that I actually do believe.
Why are you calling it jingoism? It might be patriotism, right?
Yeah. Nationalism, patriotism, jingoism, you can.
Yeah. Shamik and then Kamil.
I think this DeepSeek question is interesting. It's interesting because it sets up a comparison that people used to love 15 years ago and don't love anymore, the comparison to China. And, I have a little bit of China, but, it was 15 years ago, and China,
Does the World Bank do anything in China?
it used to, less and less. And 5 years in China is 50 years anywhere else. So I was there till the end of 2010. So 15 years, many centuries ago. But, you've been talking in threes, and I think, so first I completely would, agree with what Anindya said, that there's this feeling in China across the board to want to be the best. It's not to be good enough. This word that India has of chalta hai just doesn't exist in China, right? You want to be the best. That's always been the case, right? But if you think about the threes that you're talking about the bottom up, which is the tech stock, right? Tech stack you have the AI tech stack, you have the road tech stack, whatever it is. Then you have the governance stack, which is about creating the right incentives for performance and competition, both in government and in the private sector. And then you have the top down. I mean, the US has had a fantastic focus, defense, medicine, whatever, that has driven huge quantity of research and education, which China has had, and also in 15 years. India's just nowhere on it. So the tech stack is there. It's there in India. It's there, in China. But the other two, I think, is a place to look. Does India have anything like what China has in terms of top-down, strong focus on, and wherever India does decide, like Aadhaar, India is cutting edge. But if it's not so focused, then India doesn't have it compared to what China or the US does. And the governance stack, in terms of, India has fantastic stuff in terms of democracy and institutions. But the rest of it, I mean, what China has, you're saying 2,000 places want to do autonomous vehicles. You've got to expect that, because every mayor of every district gets promoted if they perform. They have the incentive to take risks, while in an administrative system, the incentive is not to make a mistake. It's a structural difference.
But you're just taking about policy choices, because I always recoil to cultural explanations for this, right? I mean, the Hindu road of growth went from 2% to 7% without shooting the Hindus. So clearly that was an incomplete explanation. And we used Confucianism to explain why China was poor. Now we use it to explain why China is rich. Or even like we work a lot in gender, they do. And China went from foot binding women to 60% labor force participation in 30, 40 years, right? So clearly cultural explanations are weak explanations. That Chalta Hai was a child of the license Raj. It was was a child of a competition regime in the license Raj where you didn't have clients, you had hostages. So that is behind us now, right?
But I think the others explain it, right? Because the chalta hai, if I might say so, comes a little bit from the governance uh, stack that we are.
Okay, we can talk about it. You're wrong. Go ahead. Kamya.
I would also actually really disagree with that framing. But I think like the innovations of things like DPI that have come out because of really ambitious civil servants that have supported these innovations and have driven their adoption. So I think it's too simple to say. I mean, we have far set of different challenges to solve than a much more homogeneous country like China does. But I think moving forward, looking back to the topic at hand on AI and DPI, I'm curious as to kind of with both the secretaries here. First of all, I think Dr. Garg, you're doing God's work in bringing this data out. Please don't stop. I think this whole ecosystem is waiting to see more of that. I'm curious to hear on this construct of sort of AI diffusion, building on what Dr. Ravi Bapna and Dr. Ghose said, that there is tremendous value of AI in terms of enhancing human development, solving challenges and problems that were otherwise too expensive or too difficult to solve because of some of the geographic constraints that we have. How do you see the role of I guess the government in driving that kind of diffusion? Is it just about, of course there's the AI mission and an entire corpus dedicated to that, but how do you see it, how do you see the proactive role? What's the vision or the thinking going forward? Be curious to hear some of that.
If I may. I think, like I said, the critical thing, and you captured it right in the sense that the biggest opportunity, in my view, lies actually in governance. In a number of ways, I think India, as a proportion of the number of, say, people that you need to population, if you're looking at the number of judges you need, the number of policemen you need, the number of doctors you need, the number of nurses you need, the number of teachers you need, in none of these yardsticks has the number that many other countries in the world have. We are well short of that. And we are not going to be able to afford to hire very many more. We can afford a few more, but not very many more. So clearly we have to leverage technology to enhance what we can do in the governance space. And in terms of enhancing both efficiency and productivity of all of these people, technology will play a huge role, and you'll have to cover these kind of gaps. And there are a range of applications which can actually be done and which are being done. I mean, there's a range of things which people are coming up with, and many of them, there are two ways of approaching this, saying that, okay, we'll tell you what you need to do to solve a variety of problems, and we'll have these driven missions of all of this needs to be done. It is an approach we could take, but I think given country, the size and the complexity, that's never going to work, which is why we believe that we'll try and provide as much of the infrastructure as possible centrally or, through the government, but allow a lot of the innovation in how you actually do the applications and the solutions to come up both from the private sector, whether it's established companies or whether it is startups, and from agencies of government, state governments, and a whole host of others. And many of them are doing this. If you look at the agri stack, that's a huge innovation being built bottom up. I experience it even personally in terms of, when you we actually have farmland and, you go and get enrolled, and there's a whole process which is actually building towards that. The same thing can happen significantly in healthcare. If you're going to help doctors with diagnosis, in looking at X-rays, in looking at ECGs, in looking at EEGs, and truly enhance their ability. If you're looking at even possibly running ICUs remotely, based on the indicators, and a lot of the indicators getting captured. So the range of possibilities in each of these, and some of them are very, very interesting innovations. There's this guy in Bangalore who came to us with one of the experiments he was showing us of because he all of these people who ride two-wheelers as delivery boys. So since they have the map and you know exactly where they are, if you turn the camera on the other side, then what you can see is the condition of the road, and you can actually look at where the potholes are and what it is. So it's one way of actually supervising whether works are getting done. And you said, I've laid this road, have you actually done it? And you know, so there are range of these kind of applications which innovation can bring, and I think needs to be given the opportunity to flourish and bring. So what we need to do, and this is the way we've supported states to establish 58 of these centers of AI diffusion literally across the country. You said, okay, we'll fund 40% of the cost. You get money both from the state government and from industry to cover the remaining 60, and let's see what kind of innovations you can actually bring in applications that you can absorb. And if something gets reported back, then try and see whether you can scale up. So I think the opportunity of doing this is immense, and the opportunity, and I honestly don't think within the government system funding is a constraint for something of this kind. Money can always be found if there's a worthwhile experiment which needs to be scaled up, and people are finding the money and doing it. So range of things which I honestly believe can be done, and that's one area where productivity can go up without significant increase in costs and without loss of any jobs at all.
Saurabh, you want to add to that? Ma'am, would you like to? Look, I'm sorry, we're running two of you and then we're running late.
Sorry, I think part of my question was answered by Mr. Krishnan already. I was going to ask that, you know, all these successful DPI implementation, as mentioned, has been done due to the outstanding civil servants going after these opportunities. So is it going to be that we need to have like a sovereign AI development in India, because that layer understand what public needs at least sort of as a minimum sort of substack, right? And then people can build on it, because that would be a way to ensure that it goes to the, I mean, if the common people are using AI, if you have a farmer being able to talk to AI to get their answers, that would be drive the acceptance and so.
That's what the agri stack is all about. And see, there are two or three things, and I think one thing which AI has made a real difference is very often in India, everywhere they talk about Raj Bhasha, right? I mean, official language, and it's always about the people who rule. I mean, regardless whether it was Persian earlier or whether it was English later or whether it was Sanskrit to begin with, or whichever form of official language we use today, most of it, if it's written, I mean, I come from Tamil Nadu, some of the pure Tamil which is written, I don't think even the common people use or understand. Or, I mean, the same is true of Hindi. If you read official Hindi, it is difficult to do. But the fact that we've now turned it on its head, and the interaction thanks to AI, I mean, everyone says, oh, it's a chatbot, but the fact that you can actually communicate through the voice mode, I think is a huge game changer. And as that gets better and better, I think it makes a huge difference, because people can speak whichever way they actually speak, in whatever dialect they speak in, it gets recognized, picked up, and acted on without having to go through some other intermediary. And that, I think, is potentially one of the big inclusion elements which is coming in. That's something which Bhashini does, which is under the Ministry of Electronics. And that's, I think, one of the things which has been used in the agri stack, which is being used in a number of other applications. Now, to support this, we are building our own foundational models, and we've supported the IIT Bombay, their entity which is doing this, BharatGen, in a big way. A Ministry of DST to begin with, and subsequently METI, and that's almost entirely public funded. So far, I think we've deployed about 1,000 crores and more coming. There are others whom we have supported. There are so far about 15 models we have supported. That is not 100% funded, but it's received grants, it's received access to compute, and many of them are smaller language models focusing on specific problems, and one or two are larger. And those again are available. I mean, the basic reason we are supporting them is precisely for this reason, that it's cultural, linguistic, rooted in what is needed locally. Plus, we have some degree of control within the country on the.
Last question, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So this to Secretary Mosby and Secretary Meety. Secretary Mosby presented a very interesting presentation. So being an ex-banker and an insurance leader, I take a lot of interest in that. Firstly, compliments. Developing Aadhaar, designing its own funds flow and audit platform called PFMS, and then rolling out the treasury-based real-time crediting of funds to direct beneficiaries, thereby bypassing all idle floats lying around in banks, earning meager interest compared to the flow of cost of funds the government raises to bridge the fiscal deficit gap, not to mention the ghost beneficiaries that it got rid of. And now with the integration of death certificates with the scheme payouts, stopping payouts for the dead without any manual intervention, it's surely taking leaps. Honorable FM made a statement in the parliament that the government saved 22,000 crores by way of implementation of these measures. So compliments. Areas of improvement, Manish spoke of the silos in various stacks. Taking it further, I believe monetization across all the different silos would also help big time. Just for example, insurance companies could offer insurance plans over the counter, picking up finance data from the finance stack and the medical data from the health stack. Simple solution can help save huge operational costs just with interconnections of all different stacks which currently exist in silos. Your views?
Well, describing insurance companies using health data as a bug or a feature, I mean, it's not clear to me, but.
So one is the issue of using the data for public services, and the second is obviously monetizing that data for private commercial usage. I think on the first part, which even the DPDB Act recognizes, that issues of privacy, confidentiality have to be looked at very differently than when it is being used for commercial purposes. So obviously there is a lot of monetization possible, but that has to be balanced with the need for maintaining privacy and confidentiality. And I think that's something that will evolve as you move forward. But there is a clear recognition that as far as offering public delivery or public services using the data, there need to be much lesser restrictions. So I think I'll just keep it at that.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for panelists. I'm sorry we're running over time. We can continue the conversation over lunch. Thank you.